Opening remarks for this event will be provided by Tetsushi Sanobi, who is a Dean and Chief Executive Officer of the Asian Development Bank, which is a Tokyo-based think tank of the Asian Development Bank. Tetsushi Sanobi obtained his PhD in economics from Yale University and BA in economics from the University of Tokyo. He also was working served as a vice president of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Study Groups in Tokyo. Dean Sanobi is recipient of the Nikkei Book Publication Prize and the Masayoshi Ohira Memorial Prize, and the founder board member of the Japanese Association for Development Economics. Full biographies of all speakers can be found on ADBI website under the event webpage. Dean Sanobi, please.
Thank you, Dina. Good morning from Tokyo. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2021 Asian Development Bank Institute Annual Conference. Its topic is timely and important. Immediately following the COP26, which was held last month in Glasgow, our annual conference will discuss climate change mitigation and green finance, with special emphasis on Asia and the Pacific's next steps toward fulfilling their ambitious climate commitments. Over the next 3 days, we will see and hear leading researchers and policymakers provide us with their insights into how the region, especially the fast-growing economies in the region, can advance climate change mitigation, and how partner institutions like ADB can finance projects and programs vital to realizing sustainable post-COVID-19 recovery and carbon neutrality. The sharing of knowledge and views on these issues is particularly valuable given the region's heavy reliance on fossil fuel consumption and given the current severe fiscal conditions of many governments in the region due to their responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. As you see in the conference agenda, we will have 5 sessions, 2 panel discussions, and 3 keynote speeches over the next 3 days. On behalf of ADBI, I'd like to express our sincere gratitude to all speakers for joining us in this conference and sharing their insights, which will eventually contributing to guiding policymakers in the regions and beyond. We thank ADB President Asakawa for his welcome remarks, Professor Ski, IPCC Climate Change Mitigation Working Group Co-Chair, for his keynote speech, ADB Vice President Said, Director General Duan, Dr. In of Stanford University, Senior Advisor Lilo of Area, my good friend Runde, Senior Vice President of CSIS, Deputy Director Srinivasan of IMF, and Dr. Tian of ADB for panel discussion. Just to mention those speakers who will appear before the first short break. Although I cannot call all names now, we thank all the speakers for sharing their views and knowledge with us. As of yesterday, there are 1,300 registrations for participation in this conference. Thank you to all participants for taking the time to join us. As you know, nationally determined contributions and the net zero carbon targets by mid-century were announced at COP26. They cannot be fulfilled by the energy sector alone. Other sectors also need to be decarbonized. That is why the annual conference has 1 session to each of 3 major sources of carbon emissions. That is the building sector, the agriculture, forest and land use sector, and the transport sector. And we will try to address these sectors' policy and financing imperatives for enhancing climate change mitigation. Among the major drivers of improvements, The development of green finance and carbon pricing are worth special attention and consideration. The annual conference allocates to them one panel discussion and one session, respectively. Climate change is a global issue, and to address it, global collective action is needed. In enhancing global collective action, regional cooperation can play an important role. This point is worth emphasizing repeatedly, and how to cooperate regionally and globally is far from self-evident. So, annual conference will have a panel discussion on regional cooperation for facilitating more impactful and economically viable measures to climate change mitigation. With that, I wish you all very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much for your attention. Now, I'd like to introduce ADB President. Although President Asaka is absent today, he prepared a pre-recorded welcome speech for this conference. President Masatsuka Asakawa led a large ADB delegation at the COP26, which announced a range of significant climate initiatives, funding partnerships, and programs. He had served as ADB president since January 2020. Before that, he was a special advisor to Japan's Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, among other roles during his nearly 4 decades at the Ministry of Finance, Japan. He also previously worked in senior positions at ADB, the International Monetary Fund, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. I thank President Asakawa for his great support for ADBI and his recorded remarks, which we will play for you now.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to join you today at the ADB Institute's 2021 Annual Conference. This year's theme, Climate Change Mitigation and Green Finance, is extremely timely and important. The conference aims to discuss how we can help Asia and the Pacific lead the way in the fight against climate change, including through our support for the next steps after COP26. My friends, as you know well, Asia and the Pacific is one of the most vulnerable regions to the destructive effects of climate change, which continue to worsen. The climate crisis is putting people's lives and livelihood at greater risk and creating new uncertainties for the region's economies. At the same time, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that our region is the source of more than 50% of annual global greenhouse gas emissions. It is clear that bold and urgent action is needed to combat the great challenges we face. For this, we must implement new and innovative policy solutions to ensure green, inclusive, and sustainable development. Let me highlight how ADB is rising to the challenge. First, we have been stepping up our climate financing. We raised our ambition to provide $100 billion in cumulative climate finance between 2019 and 2030. Second, we have revised ADB's energy policy to reflect our decision to formally withdraw from financing new coal-fired plants. Our new energy policy will support universal access to reliable and affordable energy services while promoting low-carbon transition in Asia and the Pacific. And third, we have launched several initiatives at COP26 to catalyze climate action in the region using new and innovative approaches. In particular, the Energy Transition Mechanism, or ETM, can be a game changer in solving one of the biggest challenges in our region, namely how to retire existing coal-fired power plants. We plan to introduce ATM in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Before I conclude, let me emphasize that the ADBI is playing a complementary role in these efforts to chart a fair and equitable path to net zero carbon emission economies, while ensuring a strong and inclusive post-COVID recovery. I am confident that ADBI's evidence-based policy research, capacity building, and training programs, and outreach are responding to the urgent needs of many of our developing member countries. Let me conclude by encouraging ADBI to continue its important work using this year's conference as an opportunity to build on the momentum of COP26, the support of ADB, and the ongoing efforts of our DMCs. Your guidance on issues such as accelerating decarbonization, green finance, and climate change policies are vital to the future of Asia and the Pacific and the world. I look forward to a lively and impactful discussion. Thank you.
Now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Jim Skeer. Jim Skeer is a professor of sustainable energy in Imperial College London. His current main role is co-chair of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group on Mitigation of Climate Change. He was research director of UK Energy Research Centre and director of Policy Studies Institute. He was a member of UK Committee on Climate Change. Jim Skeer kindly prepared for us a pre-recorded video due to a time difference with London. But if you have questions, we can pass them to the speaker.
Well, good morning, and thanks for this opportunity to talk at the ADBI Annual Conference. I'll just say I'll be doing this from the perspective of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And just to say, it's a slightly awkward time for us because COP26 is completed, but the Working Group 3 report on mitigation, which has just been sent to governments, is not due to be approved till next March. So unfortunately, I cannot really talk about the content of that. So let me base the following remarks on what we have achieved so far in the 6th assessment cycle of IPCC. So first of all, what I'd like to flag, although I'm not a physical scientist, I think it's important to remember the conclusions that our physical science colleagues in Working Group 1 came out with earlier this year in August when they produced the science report. So I think there were 3 big conclusions from that report. The first one was that it was absolutely unequivocal, a very strong word, that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land. And going with that, the second message says that we can already see widespread impacts of climate change on human systems and ecosystems. It is really both the physical science, the physical impacts in the atmosphere, and the impacts are unequivocal. And I think the final conclusion is that unless we take really urgent action and change the course of emissions and get them down quickly, then we will pass 1.5 degrees warming, probably at some point in the 2030s, or even the early 2030s. So very, very strong conclusions from Working Group 1, which Working Group 2 on impacts and Working Group 3 on mitigation can follow up on. I should say our Working Group 1 colleagues are also very proud of the progress they've made in understanding the impacts of climate change at a regional level as well as the overall global level. So the last IPCC report that took a fairly comprehensive look at mitigation was the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees that came out just over 3 years ago. And it really was driven by Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which talks about holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts towards 1.5. And at that time the agreement was signed, there was a fairly good understanding of the implications of 2 degrees warming, but much less so about 1.5 degrees, which is why COP21 invited the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to produce this special report, essentially with 2 homework questions: what are the impacts of 1.5 degrees warming, and what are the related pathways for emissions of greenhouse gases? So again, not my area of expertise primarily, but on the first homework question on the impacts of 1.5 degrees warming, this is one of the classic so-called burning embers diagrams that IPCC has been producing the last couple of reports, which show the level of risk for different kinds of systems associated with different levels of warming. And so the graph on the axis on the left shows warming above pre-industrial levels, stretching up to 2 degrees warming and above. And the grey bar that goes along the centre of the screen is basically where we were in the decade 2006 to 2015. The latest data shows that we're about 1.1 degrees warming. That came out of the Working Group 1 report. So you can see the risks really start to rise for certain types of systems, and we're already seeing thresholds being crossed for some systems. So warm water corals on the left, they are already at risk. We're already losing them because of the existing levels of global warming. And in fact, they will all be gone if we get 2 degrees warming, though maybe about a quarter would survive at 1.5 degrees. The other areas where we can see, important changes taking place around between the 1.5 degree, 2 degree threshold, the Arctic region, and there's the question of how many winters we get an ice-free Arctic. About once a decade, once a century under 1.5 degrees. Other big risks in terms of coastal flooding, where you see things changing a lot, both as an effect of sea level rise and storm activity, and other kinds of flooding, crop yields, they will all start to come in at higher levels of warming. So one of the clear messages out of the 1.5 degrees report is that there are significant and discernible changes in the level of risk as you move from 1.5 to 2 degrees warming. Now, the second homework question that we were invited to address was what pathways of greenhouse gas emissions were compatible with 1.5 degrees. And the colleagues more from the Working Group 3 world found about just under 100 published scenarios in the published literature that were compatible with 1.5 degrees warming. And the left-hand panel of this graph shows the range of carbon dioxide emission trajectories that would be associated with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, with a limited amount of overshoot. Some overshoot would probably need to take place, bringing temperatures back again by the end of the century. The grey part of the left-hand curve shows what happens in scenarios where you allow an overshoot of more than about 0.1 degrees. So the big messages that came out at that time, and we will be addressing this again in the Working Group 3 report, is that emissions of carbon dioxide, because they accumulate in the atmosphere, would need to reach net zero to stabilize global warming. And that net zero time would have to be roughly in the middle of the 21st century if warming were to be limited to 1.5 degrees. Now that has implications in the shorter term as well, because there was a message that in the middle of the scenario range that emissions of CO2 would need to fall by about 45% by 2030 in order to be compatible with a long-term path towards warming of 1.5 degrees. Now, carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. Methane emissions, which have a much shorter life in the atmosphere, have received a lot of attention recently. And in the scenarios compatible with 1.5 degrees, there are also significant reductions in methane emissions, especially in the nearer term, in order to bring us compatible with 1.5 degrees. Emissions of black carbon, emissions of nitrous oxides also need to fall, nitrous oxides being primarily associated with agriculture and the use of fertilizers. So net zero for CO2, big reductions in the other greenhouse gases. Now, another message that came out of the 1.5 degrees report was that there was more than one way up the mountain, as it were. There were different mitigation portfolios compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So this shows what 4 so-called illustrative pathways that we pulled out. The solid blue lines there represent net carbon dioxide emissions, all reaching net zero about mid-century in each pathway. The grey part represents emissions from fossil fuels and industry. The orange part, emissions or sinks from agriculture, forestry and other land use. And the yellow part, slightly more controversially, sinks associated with bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage. And I'll come on to the implications of that in further on. But just to say, it's basically showing a trade-off. If we act early, and this is a scenario that presumes lower demand for energy and perhaps some agricultural products as well, then you can avoid the use of more controversial technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. The slower you go and the more you delay, the more you need to rely on sinks, especially from other technologies. So this P4, the pathway at the right-hand side, is one where significant emission reductions are delayed till after 2030. You still reach 1.5 degrees, albeit with a high overshoot, but the price you pay for that is a very big deployment of technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Now, are we on a pathway are we on track for these pathways? The answer quite simply is not. This is from the UNFCCC review, which took place earlier this year, covering nationally determined contributions as submitted up till the end of July. And clearly we've made a lot of progress since the Paris Agreement and the first intended nationally determined contributions in 2016. Emissions now might be roughly level over the next decade as a result of the commitments countries have made, which is definitely an improvement on where we were 5 years ago. But as you can quite see, this is nowhere near the 45% reductions that would be needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, we can't talk too much about this because there's very much the content of our report, but the International Energy Agency produced a net zero scenario earlier this year that gave some of the milestones that would be needed if you were to actually limit warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. So by 2030, for example, 60% of global car sales would need to be electric. Unabated coal would need to be phased out of power generation in advanced economies. By 2035, half of all heavy truck sales would need to be electric, and there would need to be net zero emissions from the electricity sector in advanced economies. By 2040, half of fuels in aviation would need to be zero emissions, and we would need to be low emissions, and we'd need net zero emissions of electricity globally by 2040. And by 2050, more than 85% of buildings are zero carbon ready, and about 70% of electricity generation would need to come globally from solar PV or wind. So very, very big changes, which we summarized up in the IPCC report in these sort of shorter messages on the left-hand side, but deep emission cuts across all systems, rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all systems. And these were very carefully chosen words from IPCC. Now, this has largely been about energy. We also just wanted to flag out the question of land use and its role as well. There were two special reports requested by governments for this cycle, in addition to the normal outputs. So one was on climate change and land, the other one on climate change in oceans and the cryosphere. And I wanted to pick out just some of the conclusions from the climate change and land report, which are very relevant. Now, the first one, in the land area, it's very difficult to think about options that either promote mitigation or adaptation. There are simply responses that may bring benefits for either mitigation, adaptation, or both. And the key message there is that many of the land-based responses actually promote mitigation, adaptation, and wider sustainable development goals all at the same time. So one of the concerns there would be food impacts on food security, for example, which is one of the columns on the right-hand side. We were interested in that report on desertification and land degradation. Many of our colleagues also very concerned about impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So there was a careful look at a number of measures across different systems: agriculture, forests, soils, other ecosystems, and then a wider variety of response options, looking at the demand side, post-harvest losses, dietary changes, reduced food waste, and some greater systemic changes like livelihood diversification, management of urban sprawl. Now, you could go through this in a lot of detail, but the basic message from this is blue is good and orange is bad. And the central message coming out of this is generally many of these measures which could contribute to mitigation are also delivering benefits elsewhere. And I think that's a really important point for thinking forward. Now, the other issue we need to consider is that there are some practices on the land side that do raise challenges. And these are basically sort of options that involve reallocating land use as opposed to improving the way that existing land is used for an existing purpose. And we picked out 3 or 4 different areas there where there were challenges, and this included bioenergy and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. We also had afforestation, reforestation and forest restoration, and biochar application in agriculture as other areas where there were potential issues. And the big message there is that it depends on the scale on which you do these things, the kind of land on which you used to do them, the kind of management practices, how sustainably the initiatives are managed. So in each case, we identified different kinds of impacts depending on the quality of the management and the scale at which the options were used. So with bioenergy, for example, if used at a very large scale, if it's contributing to several gigatons a year of climate change mitigation, there would be implications, negative implications on food security, higher food prices, as agricultural land is converted, with also implications for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And IPCC has collaborated with the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services to consider these issues. On the other hand, if it's done at the right scale, then it can bring benefits all round, and it can be fairly neutral in terms of food security. And the same thing applies for each of the other kinds of potentially problematic responses. It's how you do it that really matters. And this applies to forest management as well as bioenergy. So this is something that the Working Group 3 report will be considering in more detail, as indeed will our colleagues in Working Group 2 who are looking at impacts. Now, as I said, I can't really talk about the content of the Working Group 3 report at the moment because it's yet to be approved by governments, but we have agreed the scope of the report with governments, and I just wanted to flag out the overall structure before finishing. So there are 17 chapters in all, and in the middle of the sandwich are the usual kind of IPCC chapters focusing on specific sectors and systems. So energy, AFLU, urban systems and other settlements, which we've elevated, given a little more prominence in this cycle, and then it subsumes more specific chapters on buildings and transport. Then we have industry. But I do want to flag also two other chapters in that group. For the first time, we've got a chapter on consumption and human behaviour, demand, services, and social aspects of mitigation, which should be quite challenging to approve with some of the governments, I imagine. And a chapter 12 on cross-sectoral perspectives, where we will pick up things like carbon dioxide removal, which don't necessarily fit into a sectoral kind of structure. But besides that part of the middle of the sandwich, the outer frame is chapters 1 on the introduction and framing, and chapter 17 on accelerating a transition in the context of sustainable development. And that really sets up the framework. We really have brought sustainable development context to the foreground in the report. We have an early section, which is kind of a high-level helicopter view, as it were, based on 3 different time slices. So something looking at emission trends and drivers, what has been happening since the 5th assessment report came out, what's been driving it. A chapter 3, which looks out to 2100, the long-term thing, where we've collaborated all with our colleagues in Working Group 1. That covers issues like cumulative carbon dioxide, timing of net zero. And a chapter 4, it was suggested by governments we take a look at the closer term as well, up to 2030 and 2050. So mitigation and development pathways in the near to mid-term, which will be considering the NDCs and the Paris Agreement pledges. And then towards the end of the report, we have a set of cross-cutting chapters, national and subnational policies and institutions, where we're picking up, I think, a lot more emphasis on institutions as well as policies, and also picking up what's happening in terms of, for example, city-level developments. Another chapter we've had before on international cooperation. And for the second time, we're doing a chapter on investment and finance, which, obviously, given this conference, is very, very relevant. And it's a very tricky chapter to write, given the shaky quality, frankly, of some of the data on which we're working. And then for the first time in IPCC, again, a dedicated chapter on innovation, technology, development and transfer. So it's a fairly comprehensive report. And we have just sent the whole lot to governments to look at, and we have also sent them a final draft of the summary for policymakers on which they will be providing comments. So I hope that's provided a fairly good overview of where IPCC is at the moment. I deeply regret not being able to talk to you about the details, but I certainly hope that within the next few months we will be in a position to do that. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would like now invite Vice President Ahmed Said. Ahmed Said is a Vice President of Asian Development Bank from 2019. He has significant prior leadership experience in both government and private sector. He is currently responsible for overseeing Asian Development Bank operations in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Also, he served in senior roles at the U.S. Treasury. He was advisor of the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury and later Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in Middle East and Africa. He laid basis to what became the Santiago Principles for Sovereign Wealth Funds. Ahmed Said holds a Doctor of Jurisprudence from the University of Chicago Law School. Ahmed Said, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good to be with everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, fine.
Okay, great. Well, I'm really excited about this fascinating panel on promoting green finance for climate change mitigation. Obviously a very, very important topic, and we're privileged to have a really illustrious group of speakers with us. I'll just briefly introduce our attendees. We're joined by a number of panelists. First, Duan Shumei, Director General, the Department of International Green Finance and Cooperation. at the China National Investment and Guarantee Cooperation of the People's Republic of China. Duan is a senior economist, managing director and director general of the department I just mentioned. She has over 20 years of experience in green finance, especially in SME financing. We're also joined by So-Young In, Research Director of Sustainable Finance at the Global Projects Center at the Financial Innovation Lead at the Precourt Institute for Energy Sustainable Finance Initiative at Stanford University. So-Young is the research lead on financial innovation at the Sustainable Finance Initiative. She's a senior researcher and director of the Sustainable Smart City Finance Research at the Stanford Center at the Incheon Global Campus. We also have Aladin Rilo, senior economic advisor in Indonesia. He's a senior economic advisor at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia based in Indonesia. He previously worked at the ASEAN Secretariat for many years, where he served in various positions, most recently as Deputy Secretary General for the ASEAN Economic Community. We'll also be joined shortly by Dan Rundy, Senior Vice President on the Project for Prosperity and Development at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the United States. He holds the William A. Schreier Chair there in Global Analysis. We're also very lucky to be joined by Krishna Srinivasan, Deputy Director of the Asia Pacific Department at the IMF. He oversees the fund's work in several countries, including China, South Korea, Hong Kong, SAR, Mongolia, and the island economies of the Pacific. And finally, Shu Tian, economist from the ADB, who works on the team that produces the Asian Development Outlook, the Asia Bond Monitor, and Asia Bonds Online. So let me again just say thank you to everyone for joining us. There are a few topics more important than that of driving private capital and finance more generally, public and private, into climate change mitigation in the emerging markets generally, but particularly in Asia, which, as we all know, is already half of global greenhouse gas emissions and likely to continue to head north from there. And so I think the topic we're here to talk about is one that is arguably one of the most important topics in the world, actually, to talk about in terms of its implications for our societies and for those who live within them. I'm excited that we've got a diverse group of people to talk about this with, and looking forward to the conversation. I'd remind those joining me as panelists that there's a Q&A box that attendees will be putting questions into. So attendees, please feel free to enter any questions you have for speakers and discussants in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll certainly try to address some of those questions. So maybe we can start the program. I'd also just invite those joining me on the panel in this virtual format. If there's a subject that you'd like to jump in on, please do use the raise hand function so that we can see you and we can include you in the conversation in a bit more of a dynamic way. Finally, there's a poll up for attendees. I see that the host and the panelists are not allowed to vote, but we're looking forward to hearing what our attendees have to say on these two questions, both about ADB's work and what you'd like to hear more about. So with that, if you'll permit me, we will begin with a series of brief opening remarks and first set of questions. And so just to start that off, Aladin, perhaps I can go to you, with your perspective, coming from ASEAN and the ASEAN Secretariat. A number of countries in ASEAN, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, have announced net zero carbon neutrality targets by 2050. These were recent announcements at COP26. These are pretty ambitious and significant announcements by this group of countries. Certainly not. This does not fall into the category of things that governments announce that they expect to accomplish with ease. And so we were talking about a very ambitious set of targets. There is broad recognition that the quantum of capital that is going to be required to support a transition to net zero inevitably will require that the private sector play a key role. Some numbers that float out there more generally about developing countries are we're at about $150 billion of sustainable infrastructure today. In the aggregate, that needs to go somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion by 2030. So maybe I can start just by asking you, in ASEAN, which I think is broadly also recognized to be a very important region for this transition from a global perspective, what do you see as the biggest barriers that prevent the flow of private capital into climate change mitigation in our neck of the woods? Over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Ahmed. It's nice to see you again, and good morning to all. I think the issue of climate change is indeed an important issue for ASEAN, in a sense that climate change impacts in the region are actually increasing, both in intensity as well as frequency. But the problem in the region, as you all know, is that public resources are quite limited to be able to meet the increasing climate adaptation needs across countries and the region. And I think that's the reason why private sector investment is indeed crucial to be able to close the funding gap. One recent evidence provided by Development Bank of Singapore suggests, for example, that the average annual demand for green investments in ASEAN, including investments in climate adaptation, amounts to around $200 billion per year. But if you look at the total supply of green finance in the region, it is only about $40 billion per year. I think this implies that the supply of green finance in the region has to increase significantly over the years in order to meet the projected demand for green investment opportunities in ASEAN by 2030, estimated to be around $3 trillion US. I think there are clear economic and financial reasons, the way I see it, why we need to invest in climate adaptation and building resilience in ASEAN. But the problem here, in my view, or the key challenge in my view in ASEAN, is that there are persistent barriers that prevent ASEAN from being able to realize the volume of private funds needed or required to be able to address the adaptation goals or agenda in the region. So let me elaborate these different barriers. I think one important barrier here is the lack of climate risk and vulnerability data that can help ensure effective decision-making process in terms of investment. I think, as we all know, adaptation projects entail different risks and uncertainties associated with the sector, with the costs and benefits of adaptation measures, and so forth. Therefore, the way I see it, the ability to manage the risks and uncertainties is indeed very crucial to enable the private sector to ascertain the return on investment, and also to encourage them to invest in all these adaptation projects. In the case of ASEAN, I think the problem here is that the absence of a comprehensive risk data and instruments. And I think this is problematic in the sense that it prevents the private sector to be able to manage the climate risks and also the ability for them to invest in different adaptation projects. So one is the limited data. That is one important barrier. The second barrier, in my view, is the limited ability or limited situation in which the investment planning or adaptation planning is in the region right now. I think the ability to have an adequate investment planning for adaptation is quite crucial to be able to meet the adaptation goals and needs in the region. In the absence of effective planning, I think investments can become haphazard and also discourage effective financing in climate change. For me, one important problem here is the lack of a good policy frameworks, regulatory standards, as well as instruments that are, I think, crucial in the robust implementation of development plans and country financing strategies. And the way I see it, also the absence of concrete policies will be problematic in a sense that transparency in investment will be sacrificed if we don't have concrete policies at hand. And another problem here also is that there seems to be a lack or absence of institutional capacity or coordination at the national level. And this is important in order to ensure that the investment plans across countries are being transformed into more feasible adaptation projects. That's why moving forward, I think it is important that climate risks in the region are embedded into capital investment planning to ensure that investors have a better understanding of the risks that would encourage them to invest more in all these adaptation projects. Finally, also, I think it seems that in the case of ASEAN, there are limited financial incentives that prevent investors to participate in adaptation projects, particularly the financing part. When we talk about financial incentives, there are actually existing ones in the region. For example, government guarantees, tax benefits, and even risk-sharing mechanisms. But I think the problem is that beyond these financial incentives, our financial markets in the region are not deep enough to be able to absorb the pool of investment funds in the region at the moment. And I think this is also reflective of the fact that our region is very much dependent on short-term bank finance. Whereas if you look at the available capital investment funds in the region, they are actually of limited or short supply, particularly for the smaller economies in ASEAN like Cambodia, Myanmar, or Laos. So therefore, I think moving forward, there's really a need to strengthen the financial incentives in the region to be able to encourage more investment in climate adaptation. And here I'm talking of measures such as blended finance, enhanced credit enhancements, as well as risk reducing and revenue boosting measures to be able to allow more participation from the private sector in this area of mitigating climate change in the region. I think I better stop here for now, Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldine. As always, your comments are so insightful and so informed by your perspective on the ground. It was interesting as I was listening to you, most of the things that you highlighted were climate specific. The last one, of course, is broader. It'd be interesting to explore as we continue the conversation, the extent to which there's an existing set of constraints on the flow of capital into infrastructure, for example, that remain unaddressed in a non-climate context, but that are also very relevant in a climate context, and in fact, become more pressing because we do need to transition economies. And I'm thinking about things like, human capital limitations, political economy considerations. You talked a little bit about market structure issues in the form of blended finance, but are there other ways that we need to address the mapping of existing market structures onto the opportunity set? So I think there's a lot there, I think, to continue to explore. Let me turn next to So-Young In. Maybe we can ask you, I think Aladdin was speaking from the perspective of government, but maybe from your perspective, how do we mobilize private investments? Specifically, since you've got a Silicon Valley background, the home of so much cutting-edge innovation in your backdrop. I'm going to turn the question to you specifically on the subject of innovation as well. The IEA tells us there's 36 core net zero technologies. They all sort of exist. 4 are mature and commercially viable. 32 need to be scaled to the point at which they're commercially attractive. No doubt there are other technologies that don't exist that also will be relevant to the net zero journey. How do we mobilize private capital into innovation for low carbon and net zero technologies in Asia? And where do we need to mobilize it specifically? Is it a venture problem? Is it a scaling problem? Is it a implementation problem?
Well, yeah, first of all, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And then it's great. And I already have really great setting already set up by Alidin. And so, yeah, let me just re-emphasize, like this climate context already highlighted by Alidin, but with more perspective from like private sector, like investors and business owners. They have really growing concern that the significant portion of their businesses, infrastructures, and assets are being stranded. And then, as we are, as we are exposed to more frequent and detrimental climate events, and also we are expediting our transition process toward net zero. So, they are really concerned about how much, how much impact there will be on their investment portfolios or companies' corporate balance sheets and so on. So, and then, through like a series of discussions, not only the tech developers or the companies who are actually investing in those companies or the investors or the policymakers, we are really thinking about, the integrated approach is really, really needed. And then the flip side is, if there's no integrated approach to it, then, we are seeing already the conflicting views between, public sector and private sectors, or different positions coming from sectors, groups and geographies, those are the very illustrative examples that, for us not having integrated approach. And then, one of the consequences to those, uncoordinated efforts is widening funding gap, as you mentioned, especially in, like a low carbon transition. And I'm not going to mention, the widening funding gap that we are having in energy supply and infrastructure. But, the question is then, we need really large scale of capital, and we are way behind of it, way behind of the curve, then where this money should come from, like a public sector and private sector. And in that question, mobilizing capital itself is really hard, especially in the new energy sector, because of the two reasons. I think the first is developing and commercializing new energy technologies requires large amount of capital for long-term period of time. And then the second is in Asia, especially, governments or public sector used to be the leading those previous transition that is important for the economic growth and development. And also many Asian countries are bank-based financial systems. But if you are seeing that, the equity investment can play or should play a very important role in stimulating those technological innovations. And now we know that, public sector cannot really provide 100% of the capital need to, to really do this technological innovations, and therefore, a low carbon transition. So, the question where this money should come from is no longer a either or type of question, but we really think about, how can we really put public and private sector put together in one place, we are talking about private-public partnership. So we got a really good positive sign from recent COP26 that, 450 or more financial institutions managing $130 trillion commit to, they are going to invest in low carbon transition. But then, the next test we have to really think about is how we can actually move forward this intention to execution. So the scarce, due to the scarce amount or limited amount of, those public financial resources, we have to think about what might be the transformative way to use this public capital to catalyze investment capital from diversified sources. We can think about blended finance here. So here, I again highlight this alignment incentives of those, diverse investors groups, because, if they are diverse, unlike the public sector, private sector has very heterogeneous investment objectives and, like expectations and like a risk profiles and so on. But there's like a lack of understanding of different, like those heterogeneous interests of those diversified groups. And then, therefore the incentives are just remained as misaligned. So if, this alignment of incentives fail, then we will see the funding gap that we are having is further widening. And we are already seeing the value of this, particularly widening in clean and renewable energy sector. Value of this refers to the severe funding shortage that entrepreneurs face in commercializing their technologies and entering to the global energy market. So we are seeing, those early stage technology developments is actually needing a lot more money. And the second part is this alignment of incentives should be done in comprehensive and inclusive way. If otherwise, it will be leading to the inefficient allocation of capital. So like, for example, we are seeing saturation of money in, like a particular industry, while other sectors is still experiencing like a severe funding shortages despite their substantial impact to the low carbon transition. So yes, it is very important to, like align the incentives, but, that has to be, that has to require, like in-depth understanding of this diversified atmosphere within this private sector.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think your comment about, I think one of the things that plagues public sector conversations about mobilizing the private sector is this shorthand assumption that there is uniformity amongst private sector actors. And I think, as you highlight, there's both a wide range, but also there are existing structures to private markets that were developed for a certain set of problems, and they scaled against a certain set of opportunities and against a certain set of legal constraints and even tax constraints, and they don't always map on well to the opportunity set that that the energy transition represents. I want to ask you just one quick follow-up question before we move on, though. You mentioned certain sectors you have excess capital flowing, certain sectors are not getting the capital they need. Could you give us just quickly an example before we move on?
Yeah, of course. So I want to highlight my recent research on, like a clean technology sector in the US, for example. So, we see great influx of money early 2000, but, like after, like we've been seeing the, traditional venture and PE, investment practices were failed to find, like a really the attractive, like a risk-adjusted return out of their desired like a time horizon. We see as a result, like a big retreatment of those, traditional venture capital from this clean tech industry. And even if, there are some remaining money, but those capitals are actually going to non-hard tech sector. Like, for example, like within the clean energy sector, there could be like hard technologies that, like really build the built environment and, like getting into the commodity market, which requires way much more money and a way much longer time, versus there could be some like still challenging, but relatively easy sector, like we sometimes call like a soft tech, like some, like a, like the efficiency improvement, programs, or those kind of like not related to like a built environment or like existing commodity market. We are actually seeing the like a fluctuation, the saturation of the money that is actually going toward those soft technology, clean tech, not to the hard technology. So if you're looking at like a recent 10 years of, like a clean tech industry exits, it's really hard to see, like hard tech companies actually get out from the lab to the market. So this is like a severe problem. However, banks are still hesitant to going into this market because it's too early still, and it's still early in the curve of their risk. So like there's no banks and there's no venture capital wants to be come earlier and stay for longer time. So there's definitely the funding gap in between what the banks in the later stage can do and what the traditional venture capital can do in the early stage. So like we have to really think about how to intermediate new source of capitals in this void spot.
Yeah, that's a great point. What you just mentioned, is something that my own phrase for it is, I call it the trilemma of late stage clean tech. And the trilemma of late stage clean tech is that it's too low return for private equity venture growth. It's too long duration. It represents perceived not always real, but perceived technology risk. And so the bank markets aren't there for it, and neither are the infrastructure investors. And until you scale it, it's too expensive for the end user. And so it can languish. And then, the other thing you talked about is, hard tech is just totally different, right, to finance. I mean, one description I heard from a VC, experienced VC of their business model, he says, we like to spend a small amount of money to support a small team for a short period of time to aggregate large amounts of revenue with large margins and a big exit multiple. And he said, none of those 6 criteria holds in clean tech, not a single one. And so it just doesn't fit. It just doesn't fit the traditional venture model. And this was the point I was getting to about, there's this irony. On the one hand, you have a world flush with liquidity that's looking for long duration, stable, not high return assets. And that's the actually ultimate owners of the capital, right? And then you have a series of intermediaries that are developed, financial institutions, banks, private equity firms, asset managers. And then you've got these needs. And the intermediaries were developed for a set of challenges very different from the biggest challenge the world confronts today. And so this mapping issue distorts the ability of capital to get to where it needs to go. And you have, my phrase for it is there's waterfalls and there's crevices. There's waterfalls where you have excess capital flowing, and then you've got crevices where no capital is flowing. And somehow we need to find a way to pivot this machine so that we get into the crevices and we kind of diminish the flow over the waterfalls. Now, at the end of the day, nothing is more powerful than public policy. And I think so it's a good time, I think, Krishna, to come to you, because private actors bump up against these constraints, but ultimately they're just atoms bouncing against each other in an environment that is created and controlled more so than anything else by public policy. And every time you talk to somebody in the private sector about what really must be done to drive climate action, the conversation turns quickly to the subject of a carbon price. Now, I understand that IMF staff have recently proposed the idea of an international carbon price floor amongst a small group of large emitters. Putting aside, the political hurdles, and I would say on the political hurdles, I think today we're in a world where things are changing. So it's important to put the right ideas out there because people may get there faster than we think, right? But what do you see as the advantages of this proposed international carbon price floor? What implications do you think it would have for emerging markets like Asia in mobilizing private capital? And how do we ensure that carbon pricing mechanisms don't just act as a disincentive, but actually act as a positive incentive for investment? Because we need both to happen, right? And in particular, we need to find ways for people to invest today in transition technologies that unlock carbon value later, but some way to allow them to capture that so that the incentive is high. So let me turn the floor over to you with that.
Thanks, Ahmed. Good morning, everyone. A pleasure to be here. So a little bit in terms of motivation of where we came from. So it's quite clear. I mean, everybody knows the existential threat posed by climate change. We also know a solution to that is a price on carbon to correct the externalities from carbon emissions. But what we see is in the real world, 4/5 of global emissions are still not priced. And the global average emissions price will be $3 per ton. That's a far cry from the global carbon price of $75 a ton we need to reduce emissions to enough to keep warming to below 2 degrees centigrade. So to get carbon pricing to where it should be by 2030, or within 10 years, that's where we thought about this thing about having an international carbon price floor. And the motivation is there. The question is to have something like that. The first thing we said is we need to find something which is a bit transparent, it's pragmatic, with a policy tool which has some chance of success. Now, again, you talked about the political dimension, I'll talk about that later. So first, to facilitate negotiation, what we thought about was the ICPF focused on a small number of countries responsible for the majority of global emissions. So we said an arrangement among China, India, US, and the EU, which would cover 2/3 of projected global CO2 emissions by 2030. If you could have an agreement among these 4 blocks, that would be an important step forward. And if you take it to the full G20, that's about 85% of the emissions. So that would be a big step. So you start off with a small group and then you expand it to a larger group. And if you design it as a price floor, that's the anchor on the minimum carbon price that each country must impose on the CO2 emissions. So it becomes more efficient, it's concrete, it's transparent, right? And that's what we link it to the investment down the road. Third, the whole issue is fairness, right? The question is, you have in the same block, you have countries which are different levels of development. So we said, think in terms of a differentiated price. So you can think in terms of, if you add, say, Canada and UK to this group of 6 countries, you can think in terms of having a price for the advanced countries, which is significantly higher than what you have for a lower income country like India. So that's the whole idea. We said, if you have for the 4 advanced countries, so something like $70 a ton, $50 for China, a country like China, a middle income country like China, and $25 for something like India, you could get to a price which would deliver on the 2030 target. So that was the whole motivation behind this. So why do you think this would work in terms of generating investment and so on? We believe that this is a carbon price floor like this provides the essential price signals. It would create incentives for investment for private sector and for private-public partnership. So as carbon emissions become more expensive under the ICPF, carbon emitters will have more incentive to improve energy efficiency. So that's one point where, and that they would have an incentive to invest in low carbon emitting technology. Similarly, as demand for carbon emitting equipment and services will decline, while demand for cleaner alternatives will increase, investors and lenders could reassess their investment strategies towards and focus towards providing financial resources to clean technologies. And finally, if countries can actually agree on this carbon price flow, that can generate sufficient revenue so that the public sector is in a position to work jointly with the private sector to provide the kind of the financing you need for this kind of investment. So that is the motivation, and that's how we see investment picking up in energy efficient industries and sectors and so on. Of course, there is an element is, can countries agree on that? I guess we can come back to that set of questions again, because this is an idea. And the question is, we have seen that despite all the pledges countries have made to on COP26, there's not much appetite for a carbon tax in that sense. So is it an idea which can work? I think at this point, it's an idea. The question is to cross the river in slow increments to see whether it can be done. But the idea is if you start with a small group, you might be able to expand that down the road. So this is an idea at this point. I can talk more about the challenges we face in actually agreeing on this and taking this idea forward to something which is more operational. Thanks, Ahmed.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That was that's really interesting. And I think, ultimately, it's going to be ideas like this that really propel us forward. The key question is, how far are we from the kind of political consensus that it would take, and what will it take to get there? And hopefully it's not it's not catastrophic climate events. Hopefully things like that don't end up being the necessary precedent for this kind of action. Yeah, and I want to come back to some of those ideas that you raised a bit later. Maybe if we can turn to Shutian next. What do you see, what do you see as, speaking from the perspective of ADB and a development finance institution, what do you see as the main development challenges for Asia to develop green finance? And I want to add just a little bit to that, to also say, what do you see as the development opportunity around climate transition for Asia?
Thanks, VP Said. My honor and pleasure to be here. First of all, regarding the main development challenge, I would say in developing Asia, well, we do observe a strong growth momentum in green finance. I think the key challenge remains to be there is a lack of commonly accepted taxonomy, and then also clearly defined regulatory framework in terms of disclosure standard and then also impact measurements, I think as mentioned by Aladdin and Daniel before. Basically, the taxonomy is actually of the most importance of all, because without such a clearly defined taxonomy, actually we cannot even measure the related impacts and then form any disclosure standard. Actually, there is already some consolidations in developing Asia. We see in the international market, the European taxonomy is leading, and then in Asia we have ASEAN taxonomies. Some markets have their own individual taxonomies, but without some further consolidation, there will be very difficult to form a larger markets and then to mobilize private capital from more general international markets. So this definitely will constrain the supply and demand in green finance in the region. On the one hand, actually corporations, they need more guidance on how to define green projects. And then this actually contributes to the current limited supply of a pipeline in green investments. And then on the other hand, in terms of the investors, they also need to be clearly understand and then have clear guidance of their portfolios to justify that their investment are really green and generating some impacts. And they also face this kind of reputation and regulatory risks. So this largely contributes to a very big development challenge in developing Asia to further expand their green finance market and mobilize more private capital to the market. And then in terms of development opportunities, I think many governments and then also ADB can work further together to actually build the capacity for private sector to better understand, well, how to prepare for green projects and then how to properly tap the green markets. Actually, there is a strong demand from the DMCs of ADB to at the same time develop the green bond, the green finance market, actually green loans and the green bond market. At the same time, there is a lot of capacity demands for the private sector to better understand how to prepare and for the transition towards a low carbon development. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that perspective. Next, if we could go to Duan Shumei. The PRC has announced very ambitious plans to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2060. Could you tell us a little bit about the Green Financing Platform project and how it will support the achievement of that very important and ambitious objective?
Well, thank you, Ms. Said. It is indeed an honor to join today's conference virtually. First of all, I would like to thank ADB for bringing us together and putting sustainable focus on mitigating climate change. In recent years, many countries have scaled up efforts to address climate crisis. My country, the PRC, is also taking different initiatives. We have pledged to peak carbon emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. To ensure this goal achieved, it is vital to file the financing gap between demands and available funds for green projects. To mobilize more social capital into low carbon sectors, the PRC government has not only piloted new tools such as green bonds and carbon market instruments, but has also further strengthened cooperation on green financing with international financing institutions like ADB. I would like to express my gratitude to ADB for providing continued support and taking invaluable expertise to assist PRC in addressing climate change. In 2015, ADB and the PRC initiated a multi-year regional air quality improvement program to utilize ADB loans of up to $2.5 billion to clean up the air and mitigation climate change in the Great Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei BTH region from 2015 to 2020. ADB has approved 8 projects, and my company, China National Investment and Guarantee Corporation, RNG, was selected as the executing agency for the 2nd and 6th loans, also known as the Green Financing Platforms, GFP project. With a total loan amount of 585 million euros and a term of 15 years, the GFP project adopts the financing intermediate loan FIL modality, which enable RNG to unlend ADB fund to targeted green sub-projects in the Great BTH region and Yangtze River Delta region. As the financial intermediary, RNG is specialized in providing various financing tools such as entrusted loan, guarantee, and equity investment to facilitate financing of green investment. By fully utilizing RNG's unique business advantage in credit enhancement, we can leverage more co-financing in polluting reduction and climate mitigation projects through the provision of guarantee and issuance of clean air bonds. Up to now, the GFP has withdrawn 380 million euros and supported the implementation of over 500 sub-projects, which has leveraged more than $1 billion of co-financing. We aim to provide tailored financing services to clients that have difficulty to access financing from the market. Take SMEs examples. Due to lack of credit record and collateral, we often have trouble in accessing affordable financing. To help them to overcome the barriers, the GFP actively reach out to SMEs and offer direct loans with a flexible design in loan amount, term, and repayment methods. Moreover, to leverage more co-financing, the GFP also worked closely with other counterparts like financial leasing companies and regional guarantee companies. On lending RNG's loan to financing leasing companies enables the GFP to further expand its scope to a wide range of qualified sub-projects. Working with regional guarantee companies helps screen out and recommend local green sub-projects. In addition to providing financing support, the GFP also helps forge the institutional and technical capacity to access financing. We have organized 14 workshops and training with over 480 people trained in environmental impact assessment, financial assessment, and post-loan management. The GFP endeavors to give a full play to its environmental, social, and economic benefits to support the PRC's government in achieving its strategic goals on environmental sustainability and climate change mitigation. As we move forward, We will continue to strengthen our partnership with ADB to advance the progress on green development investment and capacity building. We also look forward to joining hands with other counterparts to promote green finance for climate change mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview of the important work of the center. Next, we're going to go to Dan Rundy from the Center for Strategic International Studies. Dan, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Ahmed. Thanks, ADBI and ADB for hosting this important conference. It's very timely. Let me start with a story. It's hard to compete after, I really appreciate the organizers accommodating me and having me speak. So I want to, after all these presentations, let me try and get your attention. So I have a friend, and my friend bought a really expensive sports car, and he's going through what we call in American English, he's going through midlife crisis. I don't know if you know what midlife, if you know in English, midlife crisis. And so he invited me to his house. He has a big mansion, and he invited me to his house, and he's got this big mansion. He's got a very, very expensive sports car. This is a true story. It's not me, okay? And he says, come look at my sports car. I spent $200,000 on this red Porsche. It's electric. And then he started to explain to me what his hopes were for what this red Porsche was going to do for his love life. And I was privately skeptical, but polite. And so I said, okay. And he said, this car is electric. That's why it's $200,000. This house that I'm renting is 70 years old and has the wrong plugs. So I have to take the electric car to the shopping mall to charge it for 4 hours every Monday. And so my view is that until my friend doesn't have to take his $200,000 red Porsche sports car to the shopping mall to charge his electric vehicle, that the carbon transition is going to take a long time. So so I think there's a whole bunch of implications of that. There's electricity and the grid and smart cities and having the right plugs in your house and whether you have the right kind of electrical stuff. Now, I know that technology is also going to improve a lot, and I know that we have some ability to recycle metals. But if so far in this conversation, we have not used the term mining. Do you know how many kilograms, since this is Asia, I'm not saying pounds, but do you know how many kilograms of copper are in a Tesla battery? It's 90 kilograms of copper. So there's lots of discussions in global fora about rare earths. In American idiomatic English, I'm worried about meat and potato earths, regular earths, copper, nickel, yes, of course, cobalt and lithium, of course, and other metals I cannot pronounce, funny named metals that are in little teeny amounts that we need. We're going to have to, decarbonization does not mean demineralization, and decarbonization doesn't mean dematerialization. So if we're going to have a carbon transition, we're going to have to put mining on triple steroids. Not just one level of steroids, like 3 levels of steroids. We're going to have like not one step change in mining, but multiples. Don't believe me. This have been studies by the World Bank that talk about this. So there's going to be a series of challenges. So when I think about Asia, I think about, okay, the Pacific Island countries like Papua New Guinea that have significant mining. I think about Indonesia that have significant mining. There are 48 countries in the Asian Development Bank lending footprint. I think the Asian Development Bank is one of the most important institutions in the world. And I think what you do and what ADBI does and having this conversation is very, very important. So my message to this audience is that the carbon transition is going to take a long time. Like, tell me when we're going to have a fully electric vehicle fleet in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I'll tell you, we've had a carbon transition. Tell me when we've had a quintupling of mining activity. So many, I would argue, in capitals like Washington, the discussion about minerals is not priced into the carbon transition discussion. It's almost like an inconvenient truth or an unpleasantry we're not talking about. You know, these cars that show up in the showroom for Tesla don't just magically appear. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into this. And there's going to be all sorts of rethinking of supply chains. I also think it's in the context of the COVID disruption, is in the process of reshuffling global supply chains in all sorts of ways. So yes, there's been a series of other things, Ahmed, that have been raised that I don't think I need to repeat too often, but I'll just say a couple of things. I don't think we've got a common definition of what green finance is. There's like, I think we've been polite about it in this call, but there's like 3 or 4 different, there's like competing definitions of what that is. Yeah, and so I'm in a think tank, I'm at a research institute. Of course, I'm going to say more data, right? Like that's like an employment program for think tankers and researchers like me, like more data needed. So no, don't get me wrong, I'm all for more data. Of course, I'm going to say more data. So sure, we need more data. But frankly, these things also require, so in addition to all things I've talked about, my friend with the midlife crisis, with the $200,000 red Porsche that charges his car at the shopping mall for 4 hours every Monday, and the fact that we're going to have to put mining on triple steroids or quintuple the steroids. And I don't think we've thought through in the portfolio, like how many MDBs are thinking about, if I'm going to move from oil and gas to mining, like what percentage of my portfolio is going to be mining? Like if this is, I think, a real issue. So I think there's a series of big dilemmas that we haven't fully thought through. My argument would be if this is as serious as it is, then this is going to be one of the hard trade-offs I think we're going to have to think through. So I think it's going to take a long time. And then finally, my other point is that we need that ultimately private capital, there's not going to be enough soft capital from foreign aid or DFIs or MDBs to kind of incentivize the private sector to do that. We're going to have enabling environments that make it attractive, not just subsidies. There's been lots of discussions about subsidies. This is ultimately has to be like, this actually has to work on it. I agree on some of the points that have been made earlier about like, some of this is about long-term capital and some of the things you've seen in the United States in terms of sort of technological innovations. So I've put a lot on the table, Ahmed, but I would just ask folks to remember my friend with the Porsche. And until he doesn't have to charge his car for 4 hours at the shopping mall, the carbon transition is going to take a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for your, as usual, insightful and punchy remarks. Always appreciated. There's a lot there, I think, to dive into. I think your friend, maybe the easy bit is your friend. I think your friend's got a simple problem. He rents and doesn't own. If he owned, he could invest in the upgrade of the electrical system at his house. And maybe there's a metaphor in that for broader transition issues. But you raised a whole bunch of, I think, really important topics. I mean, I think first, like this is hard. We're talking about turning the world on its axis, right? We're not talking about something simple. And that has implications for everything. And I think, pointing to mining is a good way to highlight, that this is not some kind of virtual digitized world. We're talking about real things, right? And real problems in real places. I think the other thing you said that I think is really, really important is that, doing hard things in difficult environments inevitably means that you cannot get there with simple narratives. And so you're inevitably going to have to do things that either buck conventional wisdom of the moment or are politically unpalatable to some who haven't fully thought through the issues because they're complex and they're changing. And I'm not sure that today's set of public sector institutions, has the stomach for the kind of volatility that comes with taking positions that are outside of, some broad sweep of conventional wisdom, particularly given the governance arrangements that affect such institutions. And then I thought you made a really important comment about there isn't enough soft capital You know, there are people out there, you know, Larry Fink, the most prominent amongst them, saying, you know, just give me enough of a subsidy and I'll deliver you $1.5 trillion of new investment need. And I think there's two problems with that. One is there isn't enough cheap money out there. And at some point, by the way, the question becomes not, is there enough cheap money, but is the government just better off doing this, right? I mean, the cost of borrowing, you know, one of the assumptions in today's conversation has been that governments can't. And we're talking about in Asia, a region where governments actually have healthier balance sheets than in many other parts of the region, have access to capital at scale, at low prices. You know, are we making the right set of judgments about, you know, where the boundary is between public and private sector? I think that's a really important question. But then the other bit of it is, even if you throw as much subsidy at it as you possibly can, and even if you're unconstrained from the perspective of subsidies, one of the questions I think that came up as we listened to the earlier speakers is, like, is the problem not enough money, or is the problem not enough projects? And I certainly am of the view that at some point you're pushing on a string when you subsidize funding. The reality is that the pipeline of projects is not there. And it's not there for a whole host of complex reasons that are difficult to address. And that's the hard work that institutions like the ADB are asked to do day in and day out, hand in hand with governments, right? Upgrade institutional capacity, create enabling environments, address political economy issues. Like, this is hard blocking and tackling in the real world, and it doesn't proceed necessarily very, very quickly. So I think, you know, a whole host of interesting points, you know, both from you, Dan, as well as from our other panelists. I'm going to pause here because I was going to move to another section of questions, but I actually want to open the floor up to ask if any of, we've now kind of heard one round of comments from everyone. And, you know, I sort of gave a bit of my own perspective on what we heard in aggregate. But if anybody else wants to comment on the discussion up until now, I'd sort of welcome anybody from our panel. Please, Krishna, over to you first, and then others also will come to you if you're ready to speak after that.
I think, Ahmed, you raised an important point when you said, is it too much money, or is it too little money, or too few projects? I think that goes back to the whole issue of price signals, right? If you don't have the right incentives, how are you going to invest? I mean, that's where the whole thing on the viability of projects comes in, right? So when you think in terms of you know, how could you incentivize people to invest in something? If you think in terms of a carbon tax, I think it's a very transparent way of signaling, of having price signals. Unfortunately, the appetite for a carbon tax is not there. I mean, if you look at countries across the spectrum, very few countries are actually interested in this. The question is, how do you generate a carbon price equivalent, which would give the right signals to private sector to invest, the financial sector to invest in these projects? And I think that's where things become a bit murky, because there's nothing which comes close to a price signal, no? And I think that's the problem we all face. How do you enforce? How do you provide the incentives and link that to how do you price carbon? I think that's where we all have a problem. So, so when you talk about too little projects or too little money, I think to me it's the incentives which matter a lot, and that's where we're really struggling.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, this is So Young. I just want to highlight on, you know, our discussion because, you know, like when we are talking about low carbon transition, we're asking investors to, you know, change their investment as usual to something new. We're asking business owners to change their business as usual to something new. But we are not really thinking about when, you know, when it comes to the public sector, we are not really thinking about the policy to be changed to something. So like, for example, when we are talking about why this clean tech is not really come up in the speed, and then, you know, like many of us, you know, like are thinking about how can we really increase our ROI on those, you know, clean tech clean tech companies or projects, project by project. the thing is, like how can, like we can also think about, like this is one of the examples, but I want to have like a brainstorm with, like you brilliant minds in here, like what might be the immediate, more creative way to really think about what else public policy can do. Like, for example, we can also think about, instead of just increasing in the limited pool of capital and in limited pool of project, how can we really boost the revenue stream or ROI? But we can also think about how can we bring in more capital? How can we bring in more projects? Like, and then what the government can do in terms of that, like a flow of information instead of flow of capital. I think that is very important role that the public sector can think of as, as the change and expedite the low carbon transition. So let me give you some examples. So in the study of the early stage clean tech industry, the problem is, there are many willing or at least interested investors. And there are many entrepreneurs, at least in the US, who wants to develop the new energy technologies. The thing is, there are only few limited companies who has like a VIP access to the venture, like a traditional venture capital, who can actually access to those, existing companies or, like a project or developers that they are kind of like dominating this market. And what they do is, since they cannot stay for the longer period of time until those companies to get exit, so what they do is they have to leverage those private information that they get from the early stage of their investment and sell it to the like a later stage for more expensive money. So like there's a lot of suspicion going on that, later investors, not only that they are taking the risk in nature, but they're also like have to be really fighting for those asymmetric information that is under certain circumstances. So, like then I think that is where the public sector can really sit in and really, like, how can I say it, the improve the flow of the information, and then by doing so, then I think, the diversified investors will have more certainty on the project that they're looking at. And then, more, like a stepping into this market. So, I mean, this is one of the examples. But we can also, like this, I want to really brainstorm with you all that, how can the public sector can do better than just, providing subsidies, or, like carbon pricing is important, but it is not really speeding up. Then what else we can do?
Great question. Anybody want to react to that? I think information, obviously, right? So that private actors are able to, those who choose to act on that information. Anybody else want to respond to that question?
I had hoped, So Young, that there had been, I saw this article in The Economist, I guess it was this week, about venture capital. There's sort of a meme out there that there's I want to call it democratizing of venture capital, but I suspect it's probably not as much as one would hope. So maybe one of the things for institutions like the ADB or aid agencies, I mean, there are things like there are various sort of quasi-public funds to enable some of this. So it's just, there is a role for public money, and there's a role for sort of, the reason you have DFIs is to have demonstration effects and say, look, and so maybe there's some sort of market failure, and some of these folks that have got innovations don't seem to be able to get access to kind of Sand Hill Road funders. Maybe that's something that needs to be looked at as a failure.
I think, maybe just to jump in with my own views, I don't think this is a classic market failure. I think it's, in my mind, and there's a lot of different pieces, obviously. Now, when we're talking about early stage, and we're talking about net zero technologies and early stage investment into net zero technologies and clean tech, that's a totally different problem set from driving infrastructure in emerging markets, right? Solar, wind. So here, to me, it's a market structure mismatch, which is different from a market failure, which is a market failure is an economic term, which implies that the government has to step in to ensure that price signals are appropriate, that externalities are accounted for, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge to me in early stage investment, and so Young, you obviously are much better informed than me, so you should jump in and correct me. But the challenge is that we built a venture ecosystem over a period and scaled it enormously around digital technologies, which are zero marginal cost of production, which are not hard tech or hard science. And so we scaled an economic model, appropriately so, around a different problem. And that different problem means that the structures that were designed and that are now very large, right, and represent the bulk of financial intermediaries capable of addressing this, actually aren't fit to purpose. I actually feel the corporate environment is a much better, corporates are, there was an era in the United States pre-venture when corporate America was the primary driver of innovation, right? It took R&D out of the lab and it commercialized it. And then that changed in the 70s and 80s and 90s and the 2000s. But it almost feels to me like the better alignment of cost of capital, longevity of capital, risk, expertise actually exists in the corporate context. And one of the questions is, how do we get companies to be rewarded and to have a sufficiently long-term outlook so that they start making the investments they need in these sorts of technologies? Because their balance sheets seem to me better positioned for it. I'm curious if anybody's got any reactions to that.
Let me just chime in. I think this is a great point. I mean, I can just, draw one relevant example or supporting evidence to it. Like, for example, if we see pharmaceutical companies when they're developing really, like a challenging, a cure for, like a challenging disease or something, pharmaceutical companies, like a large corporates, were investing huge amounts of money in the early stage, technology development. And their ecosystem was very much coordinated. And then, what was behind of it was, like some licenses and patents for the new drugs. So I think, that was, where the, policy can work, like they are actually giving certainties that, like still it is an early stage, but there should be, like a lot more return potentials if you come into the earlier stage. So, like that, how the corporate incentives were very much aligned with, early stage development. And, obviously pharmaceutical companies has a lot more know-how, network, and knowledge is in the field. So, I mean, like instead of just, like other like a venture capital that's running like a diversified portfolios, those companies are better suited to, grow and push those technology into the relevant market. So that could be some benchmark example.
Yeah, that's it's interesting you say that, because one thought I've had in the past is that actually the structure of big pharma is the closest analog to the market structure you need for climate tech, because big pharma marries three things. It marries scale capital with deep technology expertise and commercial distribution capability, right? Production and so you can have a high risk innovative ecosystem where you can sell into at high return into a platform that's capable of taking your well-developed concept, assessing its commercial viability, technological viability, and making a high stakes multi-billion-dollar bet consistently. And there's nobody like that in clean tech. Like there's nobody like that in clean tech who can make that bet. So I think that's a really interesting.
Yeah, like we are seeing like a CVC arms that is underneath, like a big energy companies, like Shell has one, Chevron has one, but I do not think that they are like those CVC is becoming the mainstream of those corporates' business model. So why is that so? I mean, I'm just throwing, some of the question in my mind, but, and then what the policy can do in terms of, like making that alignment.
Yeah, and I think on policy, like coming back to your question about information, I think making, even if you don't impose carbon pricing, but making it more transparent, allows private sector actors to align voluntarily, right? So one of the interesting things that I've learned recently is that a number of large global investors are imposing carbon prices for their internal comp schemes. So some of the largest liquid pools of capital in the world right now don't pay carried interest to their teams until they impute a carbon cost to the return earned on the portfolio. And so, but you need data for that. And if more and more private actors start self-imposing a carbon cost internally, that's a way for, at the end of the day, nothing gets us there other than a carbon price or a carbon tax, but you can start to inch in that direction, I think, in some ways. Okay, good. Well, I thought that was a useful and interesting exchange. Anybody else want to jump onto this before we move on? Okay. All right. Well, Aladdin, back over to you. And I want to now turn from the question of the set of questions that we were talking to kind of lessons learned. A number of ASEAN countries have feed-in tariffs for renewable energy. And this has certainly been an effective way to attract private investment. What do you think we've learned from the use of these feed-in tariffs in ASEAN, and where do we go from here?
Thank you, Ahmed. I think you're right that the feed-in tariffs, or FIT for short, has been a popular policy tool adopted in ASEAN, I think since 2017. And if you look at what's happening in the region right now, there are 5 countries that have been actively implementing the scheme: Indonesia, I think Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. And in implementing the scheme, each country is able to adopt their own requirements and also the specific best practices. For example, in the case of Malaysia, I think Malaysia has been able to adopt a more established and transparent application system for the FIT scheme. And also, I think they were able to streamline the contracting mechanism that supports the independent power producers. In the case of Thailand, Thailand's scheme is more comprehensive in my view, in a sense that it offers more incentives for the different types of renewable energy technologies. But I think there is no doubt here when we talk about feed-in tariffs that this is an important policy tool. But for me, the way I see it, it's not just a matter of payment, this market above market tariff or the feed-in tariffs, but I think it's also a matter of how the different conditions in the markets are being put into account, right, to make sure that the implementation of this scheme is effective. When I look at ASEAN, I think there are 2 important factors that I think are crucial in the successful outcome of the feed-in tariffs in the region. One is the policy design. I think this is something that you mentioned earlier, right, during the earlier discussion. The strength of the policy design and how it is incorporated into the market dynamics, for me, is very important. Take the example of Indonesia and Philippines, in Indonesia and the Philippines. Both countries actually have adopted the feed-in tariffs in more recent years, but the outcomes are quite different. In the Philippines, there is more significant results in terms of the growth in renewable energy. But in Indonesia, the results are quite limited. I think one reason for that is the policy design itself. For example, in the Philippines, the government has been able to implement a lot of best practices in terms of the development of the long-term framework for renewable energy. The government also introduced a lot of incentives in addition to the tariff itself. And also the government in the Philippines was able to absorb the cost, from the end users rather than to the independent power producers. When you look at Indonesia in this case, I think it's a different story. I mean, the the fact that the power of implementing the feed-in tariff scheme is put under the leadership of the state-owned entity, I think creates some kind of transparency issues in my view. I think one very good example of that is how the pricing strategy is being developed. In the case of the feed-in tariff in the Philippines, there's only a single and consistent tariff being applied. But if you look at the scheme in Indonesia, there is a wide range by which the tariff is being determined. And I think the problem with that is that there's a lot of uncertainty and also a lot of apprehensions that is being created on the part of the investors. The second important factor here, aside from the policy design, is the economic and political condition affecting the energy markets. Again, it is very important to make sure that the market conditions are conducive to the development of the renewable energy. In the Philippines, again, for example, I think the conditions were good enough to develop the renewable energy, in a sense that the Philippine government introduced a lot of market-based reforms. For example, they privatized a significant portion of the distribution and distribution of the electrical power in the region, as well as they also established a more independent regulatory body. At the same time, the Philippines, as I mentioned earlier, provided a lot of incentives to the investors right at the beginning when the scheme is being implemented. And that, I think, created more incentives, particularly for technologies that are more difficult to become more attractive for the investors. But when you look at Indonesia, I think, again, a different story here. I think it's very important to look at the actual experiences here. In Indonesia, I think the fact that the government still maintains some kind of monopoly, in a way, created some kind of transparency issues, you know. As I mentioned earlier, the one implementing the feed-in tariff scheme in Indonesia is the state-owned utility firm. So there are questions here on how the pricing strategy is being developed and so forth. At the same time, I think it is also important to look at the current status of the energy markets in both the Philippines and in Indonesia. In the case of the Indonesia, for example, I think there's little incentive to develop the renewable energy, in my view, in a sense that they also have a very large reserves of fossil and gas reserves. And therefore, they look at the feed-in tariff scheme as just a mechanism to promote greater electrification in the rural areas, but not as a tool to achieve energy security, like in the case of the Philippines. I think the fact that there is that kind of disincentive would also explain why the outcome of the feed-in tariff scheme in Indonesia and the Philippines varies. So in short, I think there are two important factors. One is the policy design. We have to make sure that the policy design is something that the markets really understand. And secondly, we have to take into account the existing economic and political conditions. Otherwise, we cannot just look at one specific pricing strategy like the FIT or the feed-in tariffs without making sure that that particular pricing strategy is in line with the overall market dynamics. Yeah, I think that's how I see this particular feed-in tariff scheme worked in the case of ASEAN, Ahmed.
Thank you, Aladin. I'm going to jump, Shutan, to you really quickly because I want to ask you about. We've talked a lot about private capital flows, and if you can share anything from, ADB's own work in terms of what policy instruments Asian governments have used or can use to mobilize private finance for green projects. What have we seen working? What have we been recommending? What more do we think we can do? And what has ADB been doing to support green finance development across the region?
Thanks, VP. Actually, as we just discussed during between the two rounds of questions, we do need a financial market that can align this finance to SDGs, or actually it is basically means we can internalize this environmental externalities into this financial market so that it becomes organic part of the market, and then every externalities can be priced in. So this means beside fiscal measures, for example, like direct and indirect government investments in green projects, and then also some incentive programs like grants, subsidies, tax incentives, and also guarantees, Asian governments can can spend more efforts trying to develop financial markets that are properly aligned with SDGs or climate change targets, basically via developing proper legislation and regulation framework. So just to make environmental and ESG concerns as a part of the financial markets itself. In doing so, governments can really develop the market by aligning taxonomies and disclosure standard and impact measurements. And then also there is a huge demand to build the market itself to strengthen the ecosystem, like rating agencies, and then we just need more mechanisms to provide additional services and information flows that makes the market function. For example, in conventional markets, there is rating agencies to assess the default risk, but in this new green finance market, we also need some kind of services that can properly assess the related environmental risk, and then to justify that these green projects and investments are able to deliver some environmental impacts. I think that is part of the market development. And turning to ADB, actually we have been working closely with developing member countries to develop these markets. ADB at the same time participate in the market itself via direct investments into the green projects around the region, and then also ADB develop new instruments to catalyze more finance. For example, actually ADB's ASEAN catalytic green finance facilities help reduce risks on ASEAN green projects, and then help to leverage more private capital. ADB also launched a green bond projects, which has been raising I think more than 10 billion USD since 2015 to finance for these green project investments that ADB has been supporting. And then at the same time, ADB also work as a knowledge bank to strengthen policy knowledge and capacity to help member countries to develop the market itself. And then also ADB took lead to this taxonomy development, and then also a building ecosystem via different technical assistance. So basically, ADB has been participating in the market and then also supporting the market, the governments to develop the market itself.
Thank you for that, Shutan. Maybe rather than continuing with the set of questions, I'm gonna go to the Q&A. We've only got 9 minutes left, and we've got a number of questions from our audience. So maybe I'm going to try to pick one or two of these. Let me just go through them. Let's see. Okay, I think here's an interesting one. Can we please explain what role the general public can play in driving green energy acceptance and adaptation in less developed countries? What role do we think? We've talked a lot about governments, we've talked about companies, we've talked about venture capitalists, we've talked less about people. Would anybody like to comment on the role that the general public can play in driving climate action across emerging Asia?
Hi, may I jump in here?
Yes,
so actually, public actually plays a key role to drive investment in green finance. Basically, what we observe is there is already a general shift in public interest and a preference towards investment into this ESG themed and green themed investment. And then this kind of public preference shift it's already generating some financial incentives that helps to direct more investment towards green projects globally. For example, based on some surveys in the financial institutions around the world, not only in Asia, but also around the world, actually there is a tendency that individuals and then also financial institutions, money managers, they seems to be receiving more funds that has a mandate to show a preference, a strong preference against this brown investment, and then towards ESG aligned projects. And then this generated some persistent capital flows towards ESG investment, and then also supported greater resilience for this ESG investment during market turmoils. So I think the public does play a role in this process.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
I have a sentence to add in. So yes, I more than agree to that. General public has really important role. Like actually, they are the ones who are actually the consumer of the goods, and then they're actually putting pressure on the companies, and that is actually pressuring on investors. But at the same time, I think this action should be also very much educated and inclusive, because otherwise, we are actually putting insufficient or inefficient actions to the company. Like, for example, we can see the greenwashing actions that is coming from companies. Companies are very much concerned about what general public's aware of their company image. So what they're doing is not just, providing a false information, but they are just, being quiet, silent about what they are doing. So in order to be, just get out of their general public's radar. So I think, it is really good sign that general public have growing of their awareness level. But at the same time, they have to think about, what might be the sophisticated way to really monitor the sustainability performance of the companies. And then, in that term, I think, those taxonomies or, those, accounting criteria or just evaluation, mechanism can help general public to really reliably access, how well the firm is doing in that evaluation.
Okay, great. We've got 5 minutes left in what I think has been a really, actually a very, very wide-ranging and thought-provoking conversation. And I'd like to just give each of our panelists an opportunity to just share some concluding thoughts, either an observation on the conversation or an additional comment that they may or may not have had time yet to make. And I'm just going to go in the order that you're on my screen. So maybe, Duan Shumei, maybe we can begin with you, if you have any concluding thoughts.
To conclude, success of sovereign loan projects need the joint efforts of international organizations, government, and financial institutions. To improve air quality and tackle climate change is a battle that we together will win. We recognize that it's going to take time and hard work. But I'm very convinced that with our shared values, interests, and ambitions, through our efforts and knowledge sharing, a zero carbon future that ensures a healthy and livable planet for future generations is within reach. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Krishna, can we go to you next?
Yeah, two thoughts actually, Ahmed. One is you talked about what can the public do. I think one thing which we could do is, I don't know whether it's been done, whether there's been surveys of what public views are on various measures that can be done to mitigate, climate change effects. And because a lot of what happens or what doesn't happen is driven by political economy considerations, right? And so it'll be useful to know for policymakers what is acceptable to the public, what is not acceptable. And so that could inform the decision making. So that's something which is a thought. The second thing is, we talk about price mechanisms, a carbon tax, and so on and so forth. But given the fact that, again, there's not much appetite for these measures in one way or the other, we should think in terms of flexibility, in terms of carbon equivalent measures, carbon price equivalent measures. And there, you have things like the emissions trading systems, you have free base, and so on and so forth. So again, these are, in my view, these are more second best, third best options. But if we could find a way by which we can translate these measures into carbon price equivalents, and it's done in a transparent way, that might give room for countries to agree together on how best to take forward carbon mitigation measures. That's again a thought.
Thank you. Thank you. Shutan?
Thanks. In general, I think there is already a trend from both the public and also the professional investment world towards ESG investment. But I think the government needs to further play a role to make the financial market ready for such a trend. Basically, the government needs to develop taxonomies, disclosure practice, and then also a common market practice that is aligned with the international standard in developing Asia to foster the green finance market to further develop in the region. Thanks.
Thank you. Aladdin?
Yes, I think two things here. One is that there is a need to change our mindset, right, about how to address climate change mitigation. During this pandemic, it became clear that this change in mindset and behavior actually has positive impact on the environment. Okay. Secondly, climate change being a regional public good would require greater cooperation, okay, from the region. I don't think governments alone will have the responsibility to address climate change financing, but we have to make sure that everybody is into this priority of addressing climate change by ensuring that the cooperation of everybody is in there. I know that there will be a separate session on regional cooperation later on, but I just want to emphasize the importance of that when we talk about climate change mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you. So-Yeon?
Yeah, I mean, creative public policy action can come up with really interesting like a workshop. Like for example, let's think about, what might be a good alternative investors who can be, like leading this energy transition. Like for example, why not sovereign wealth funds? Why not, pension funds? Like why not in university endowments? And then why they are not really working with the development banks? Because, like if you're thinking, then maybe their interest or their time horizon at least might be better matched with any other private investment institutions. So, but like I'm just like drawing very simple examples. So yes, we should understand, they have very different expectations. But what we can do is how can we really recognize this sustainability values as a financial value in their desired terms and conditions. And then we have to really start understanding how their expectations are different. And there we can start thinking about what might be the new market design, what might be new market vehicle. And also at the same time, I want to highlight the technical standpoint here. Like we need really reliable, sustainable assessment tools. And this sustainable assessment tool should be very inclusive and then very comprehensive. So I think we have to think about top down and bottom up. So top down means, we have to think about, how can we recognize this financial value of sustainability in macroeconomic factors, like what's the impact on GDP, like loan and, stock pricing, financial stability or something. If we go a little down, then we can also think about what does the impact to our investment portfolios or company's balance sheet. But if we go very into the bottom line, then we have to also think about how those sustainability affect the value of assets or projects. I mean, before it was impossible. I mean, it is very hard to get those assessments, but these days it's possible because we are having more data through data technology and analytics. So if we can do this is a broad spectrum of assessment, then I think it will be much easier and accessible to come up with a more sophisticated investment vehicle and market structure.
Thank you. And by the way, you asked the question, why aren't sovereign wealth funds working with development banks? I will take that as an opportunity to highlight one of several new initiatives that the ADB has rolled out in recent months. And that was a new investment platform focused on providing financing for sustainable infrastructure in Southeast Asia. And it's the first time that the sovereign arm of a development bank, not the private sector window, but the sovereign arm, which has the relationships with government, has partnered with a completely private sector funded balance sheet entirely to catalyze new asset classes. And so we've created with Temasek and HSBC, they intend to provide in an initial pilot, over $1 billion of financing for sustainable infrastructure in ASEAN, with the ADB through its sovereign window doing the upstream work with governments. So it's a non-subsidized private sector balance sheet, sovereign wealth fund, global financial institution, 50% in the equity, and then ADB doing upstream work with governments to create a pipeline. So we're starting to see some models emerge that are new. Dan, you set a high mark for both entertainment and keeping it real with your first round of comments. So, we're going to
try and keep it real. So my view is, if developing countries have oil, gas, and coal resources, they're going to develop them. So I disagree with the policy of shareholders like the United States and others that are saying the MDBs shouldn't be supporting that. In some instances, there ought to be some use of oil and gas and coal. My argument is that I want to go to heaven. I also want to see a carbon transition happen, but I think the carbon transition is going to take a really long time, like a 50 or 60 year long time. I'm highly skeptical, given the story about my friend with the Porsche and given the mining challenges, that this is going to happen anytime soon. I do, however, have faith in technology. So I do believe 20, 30 years from now, the technologies that we're talking about, we will see huge technological improvements. So the conversation that we're having will be different 20 or 30 years from now. So frankly, some of the best things that could happen is just investments in basic technologies. But I believe that if there are extractive resources in developing countries, they will be developed. And then my final point is, if on the issue of climate and the carbon transition, if you're not 100% on the mining train, then it's like not a thing. Then the whole climate change thing is not a thing. So like when we have conversations, we better price in, and it ought to be like front and center. Tell me about, if we're going to have the carbon transition, tell me about how much you love copper mining. And most people I know in the environmental community don't love mining. And we're not going to see mining in Fairfax County in wealthy communities, places where I live. It's going to be in developing countries. So you tell me what the track record has been in mining. A lot of people hate mining, and a lot of civil society groups hate mining. So I think we're going to be bumping up against a lot of hard dilemmas. And my final point is, I think it's the highest use of coal in human history right now. Ahmed, am I correct in saying, like, if you add up all the coal use right now in the world, it's the highest it's ever been, or it's pretty darn high? It's pretty darn high right now. I believe it may be the highest usage of coal in the world is right today. Not like, I know there was a drop last year because of COVID, but I don't think it's like, so I'm saying it's like, we may have a carbon transition, but I think it's going to take a darn long time. Thanks.
So thank you, I think, for those punchy remarks as usual. I think I wish we had another 30 minutes, because there's several of those I'd want to kind of dig into with you a bit more. I think maybe I'll just close out by saying, first of all, thank you to everybody. I think, Dan, on your comments, those countries have they got a lot of sunlight too. And they've got a lot of wind. And they've got
geothermal. I don't disagree with that, Ahmed. So you're right. Yeah. So it's an all of the above thing. My worry is that, I agree, we should think solar and wind. I agree with that. But I believe we're being naive if we think developing countries are not going to develop their extractive resources. It's naive and it's foolish.
And the way I would phrase it is that it's a call to action. I think, from my perspective, I think you've highlighted, for example, in coal, single largest emitter on the planet, right? And so what you're highlighting is, don't assume this thing is going away. And I couldn't agree with you more. But then I would add to that.
I'm hopeful about breakthrough technologies, Ahmed. I think we have to keep pushing on. We don't use steam trains and we don't use horse and buggies. And that's a good thing. And so I think I want to have cars that are electric that, that can, I want to have a transition that's a painless, attractive transition. We're not there yet.
And one of my great bugaboos is that I find that too often these sorts of panels don't represent real conversations. but I feel like we had a real one today. So, with real diversity of opinion and some really interesting thoughts exchanged. So I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us. We're grateful to you. ADB is enriched by your participation in our events, and we certainly hope that through the instrument of ADB, our developing countries are enriched by your participation. So thank you, and thank you to our organizers at ADBI. Wish everybody all the best, and see you all soon.
Ahmed, this ADB is one of the great collective action vehicles of our time. I'm so pleased to have been a part of this, and thank you for organizing this ADB and ADBI.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Dear speakers, feel free to answer questions till 12. We are about to start our next section. I would like to invite our session chair, Priyanta Vijayarantunga. He is Chief of the Energy Sector Group, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. He's also the Director of South Asia Energy Division of the Asian Development Bank in the Philippines. He was the founder of Director General of the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka and the Senior Professor of Electrical Engineering at the University of Matarua, Sri Lanka. He holds a doctorate degree in Power System Economics from the Imperial College. Full bio of all speakers available in the link which we send in chat. Dr. Priyanta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dina. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all my speakers and the discussants. And of course, over almost 200 audience we have today, wherever you are joining from. Welcome to all of you to this session 1 on energy sector transition towards high renewable energy penetration. As all of us know, high renewable energy penetration, particularly most of it is intermittent, and it has such penetration has a lot of issues when it comes to integration with power systems. So we have 2 speakers today, and the 2 discussants, of course, for each of the paper, one for each of the papers. And the first paper will be presented on the topic financing the energy transition in a low-cost intermittent renewable environment, where Professor Frank Wollock, Professor of the Department of Economics from Stanford University, from the US, will be presenting the paper. And before we start, let me remind all the speakers, please stick to strictly to 25 minutes duration, and the discussants 10 minutes, and then we will open the paper just after the paper presentations for Q&A from the audience, and before we move to paper 2 to be fair by each of these papers. And the discussant for the first paper is Professor Ryoichi Komiyama, from the Associate Professor, Department of Nuclear Engineering and Management, from the Graduate School of Engineering, University of Tokyo. With this very short introduction, we have more details in the bios, distributed among ourselves. And let me now invite Professor Frank Wollock to make the presentation, please. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Wollock.
Thank you. All right. Can I will share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. Is my screen shared? Hello?
Yeah, it's
okay.
Coming up.
Yes. So thank you very much. So what I'd like to talk about is the motivation is basically the fact that obviously many regions are attempting to reduce the carbon content of their electricity sector. Obviously, we'd like to achieve that at least cost, largely to limit our use of scarce government funds, as well as to reduce the total cost of electricity to consumers. So crucial to accomplishing this is a efficient short-term and market design and long-term resource adequacy mechanism. And one of the big things that's changed in the last few years is the fact that we now have very low-cost renewables, and these are very cost competitive with the typical dispatchable resource. And this gives us an opportunity to, if we get the design right, to significantly reduce the cost of achieving a given renewable energy goal. But a necessary condition for that to occur is this appropriate short-term market design and long-term resource adequacy mechanism. So what I would like to talk about is essentially those features that I think are experienced in electricity market design around the world have demonstrated are the key to achieving this desired outcome. So this is just showing the tremendous success that has been had with respect to both grid scale solar. You can see the levelized cost. This is data from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and it still declines for wind power. But just to put a finer point on it, this is data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, essentially showing that the levelized cost for a natural gas unit entering service in 2023 is slightly higher than what it estimates to be the levelized cost of grid scale wind or grid scale solar entering in the same year. And clearly these LCOEs will differ across regions, but it's pretty likely that there are many places where the intermittent renewables can be financially viable without any above market support. But as I said, key to making that happen is efficient, what I'll call locational and temporal pricing, and essentially the appropriate long-term resource adequacy mechanism. So what do I mean by the short-term market design? Well, a major lesson that we've learned globally from short-term market design is that the market model that you use to set prices and set dispatch levels should be consistent with the reality of how the transmission network operates. If it's not, this will create opportunities for market participants to essentially take actions to degrade system reliability as well as raise costs to consumers. This was so prevalent in the early stages in US markets that were zonal markets or single zone markets, that essentially it got the name of the so-called ink deck game. And the way the deck game would work is that a generator owner would sell energy in a zonal market that it knew could not be delivered because of intrazonal transmission constraints. And so the unit owner would say, great, I'll sell today at $50 in the day ahead market. And then the system operator would need to get that energy back because it could not be dispatched. And so the unit owner would say, sure, I'll buy that energy back at a much lower price. And the generator effectively gets paid for selling little or no actual energy. And in the deck game, ink game portion of that, the owner knows that energy will be required from their unit in real time, once again, because of the intrazonal constraints. And so that unit owner will offer at a very high price, not selling energy in the day ahead market. And then essentially in real time, the system operator will call it at an offer price substantially above the market clearing price. And, so this problem has led to what I outline in blue, the major lesson, which is competition takes place through the actual transmission network, regardless of the method unit to manage congestion. And what you get is significant distortions and a higher cost if you ignore that. And this was not only happening in the United States, this is in Colombia has a positive and negative reconciliation payment mechanism for its single zone market. Australia, for its zonal market, has the same thing. In the case of Europe, there are many zonal markets, and these costs of making these schedules physically feasible has exploded in Europe, in many European countries. And this essentially, in part, is the result of this intermittent renewable. And so the basic lesson here is that in the end, physics wins, and market participants will take actions to exploit that fact. And so the market design must reflect this logic, or you're going to have a market that's unnecessarily expensive for consumers. And so what is the solution? Well, the solution that has been found to work in this regard is what's called locational marginal pricing. And what this does is essentially runs the market with the transmission network that actually exists, not the transmission network that the market operator wished exists, but with the transmission network that actually exists. So what this means is you will not win in the day-ahead market auction unless you are physically feasible. And what this means is that you'll get potentially different prices at different locations because of that fact. And what happens is that the system operator is minimizing the as offered cost of meeting demand at all locations in the transmission network in both the day ahead and real-time market. And this design has been adopted in all short-term markets in the United States, more than roughly 6 markets in the United States, even though many of those markets started as zonal markets. It also exists in New Zealand, Singapore, Peru, Poland, and Chile. The other thing that's particularly important is what is called multi-settlement. And what that means is just simply the fact that planning ahead can save you money in markets with what we like to think of as non-convexities, or think of it as things like startup costs, ramp rates, things that make the unit not be immediately responsive to a dispatch instruction. And so all US wholesale markets operate a day-ahead forward market where suppliers submit these multi-pot offers, so like a startup cost offer, a minimum load cost offer, and then an energy offer curve. And then the system operator takes that information and minimizes the cost given those offers to serve demand simultaneously for all 24 hours of the following day, and turning on units and running units at minimum load levels in such a way as to minimize that as offered cost to meet demand. That then ensures that we get a schedule that is, again, physically feasible and recognizes these non-convexities in how we operate generation units. So the big thing that a multi-settlement market does is that you get a firm financial schedule regardless of what output level the generation unit operates at in real time. So if I sell 40 megawatts in the day ahead market at $25, I get $1,000. Now, if I don't actually produce the 40 megawatt hours that I sold, I then must purchase the shortfall, in this case, in my example here, the 10 megawatts that I don't supply in the real-time market at the real-time price. The same logic applies to load serving entities. Anything that I buy in the day ahead market, I have to pay for. Anything that I don't consume, I can sell. Anything that I need to consume, I consume more than I bought, I have to buy at the real-time price. And a big advantage of a multi-settlement market is the fact that it rewards the reliability of supply. So in other words, intermittent resources are typically not going to receive as high a price on average as the dispatchable resources because they are intermittent. They are not able to respond and produce energy when the system operator needs them. And so this is an example to demonstrate that. It says that, you know, even though we're selling both units, the intermittent resource and the dispatchable resource are selling energy in the day ahead market. One is selling 100 megawatts at $50. The other sells 80 at $50. The unit that's intermittent only produces 50, so it has to buy 30 from the real-time market. And the real-time market is likely to be much higher priced because there's very little intermittent renewable output, which means you have to get more expensive dispatchable energy from, say, a natural gas-fired unit. That raises the price. That thermal unit, it sells that 30 at that $90. We can go through the settlement process right here and see that the thermal resource receives an average price that's almost more than double the price that the intermittent resource receives, even though the day-ahead price is the same for both units and the real-time price is the same for both units. And the same sort of logic works in the opposite direction. In other words, if the intermittent resource decides to sell less in the day-ahead market, but it turns out to produce more in real time, when it's producing much more in real time, that means that we don't need as much of the dispatchable resource. So it decides to essentially reduce its output and instead buy some from the real-time market at a very low price. And again, working through the average prices, we can see that again, the dispatchable resource is rewarded with a much higher price than the intermittent resource. And so finally, this is one of the benefits of this multi-settlement system, is it rewards the fast responding units with a higher average price, which is something that we would like to do as we scale up the amount of intermittent renewables. And then the other thing that we can see is with more frequent settlement. So for example, if we run that real-time market every 5 minutes, we'll be able to provide a further reward for those dispatchable resources that operate very infrequently, but are very fast at responding, meaning they can move up very quickly or move down very quickly. So the other thing about this multi-settlement market is it addresses a significant problem that exists, which is the fact that if you have only a single settlement, you often have to come up with a way to essentially say, pick, if you like, what the demand response provider would consume if you didn't ask them to reduce their demand. But in a multi-settlement market, you can have the demand buy the energy in the day-ahead market, not consume it in real time, and effectively sell what it does not consume at the real-time price. So for example, I buy 100 megawatts at $50 in the day-ahead market, but the real-time price turns out to be $100, so I consume significantly less in real time. I'm effectively selling what I bought at $50 at $100 and making money by the fact that I reduced my demand. So this facilitates the active participation of demand. So how has this worked out in markets around the world that have transitioned? Well, two studies have looked at this question, and in California, what we found was roughly about an estimated annual savings from this transition to this multi-settlement nodal market design, or LMP market design, from a multi-settlement zonal design, saved California roughly about $100 million per year. In the case of Texas, a similar calculation found that this same transition saved on the order of about $300 million per year. And both of these markets have very large shares of intermittent renewables. So this market design can really optimize the likelihood that you will effectively get the price signals necessary for a least cost deployment of renewables in a low cost intermittent renewable regime. So the final point I wanted to talk about on this is this issue of cost-based markets. In small regions and regions with little regulatory experience, a cost-based LMP market can be an attractive alternative for essentially introducing competition. What you do in this market is, instead of market participants submitting offers, the regulator will essentially take the technical characteristics of the generation units and essentially determine the cost that the thermal and hydro generation units and operate the market based on those. This sort of market design currently exists in both Peru and in Colombia, and has worked very well for quite a long time. The idea here is that you simply just run both the day-ahead and real-time market using offers based on cost, not essentially offers that, and these offers are computed by the regulator and versus offers, and it becomes a very straightforward way to capture the benefits of this multi-settlement LMP market design without the downside that suppliers have this potentially large ability to exercise market power in the short-term market and push up prices. So this next topic is the long-term resource adequacy. And the important point that I would like to get across here is that all markets require a long-term resource adequacy mechanism. Why? It's because different from the vertically integrated monopoly regime, there is no single entity that is responsible for keeping the lights on. The market operator, or ISO, can only operate with the resources offered into the market. It doesn't own resources, it can't build resources. Generated owners can only supply from the units they control. Retailers can only purchase energy that generator owners actually supply to the market. And so what we have is this problem is there's no entity responsible for keeping the lights on. And so unless you want to treat electricity like you treat any other product, in the sense that you let supply and demand clear the market by raising the price to a level where that occurs under all possible system conditions, you create this thing, what I like to call a reliability externality. This means that if what I do is I run, say, a offer-based market or a cost-based market and the offer-based market has a finite offer cap, there can be the possibility that essentially the amount that generators are willing to supply at or below that offer cap, or at or below that cost-based market price, is less than system demand. There's no guarantee that that will happen. And so when that does, what we have is a situation where consumers or retailers know that you can't curtail the demand that did not buy sufficient energy in advance. You can only curtail demand through random blackouts, rolling blackouts. So I know as a retailer or consumer that I don't bear the full cost of failing to procure adequate energy in the forward market, because I know if aggregate supply does not exceed or equal demand at the offer cap or highest cost unit in the system, then effectively I know that it will be rolling blackouts, random curtailment. So essentially someone who has adequately procured their energy faces the same risk of a curtailment as someone who hasn't. This and the entities that buy in advance are typically going to pay more. So essentially all entities have an incentive to under procure in the forward market, and therefore a long-term resource adequacy mechanism is necessary to ensure that there's adequate supply to meet system demand under all possible future system conditions. So the typical approach to doing this is capacity payments. But in an intermittent renewable world, defining what is the firm capacity of a even hydro unit becomes extremely challenging. Defining it for the case of a wind and solar units is even more difficult. The basic conclusion that we draw based on some work that we've done is that this firm capacity approach to long-term resource adequacy is definitely poorly suited to regions with high shares of intermittent renewable energy, which is the desired position that most regions are attempting to transition to. So what is the solution? Well, essentially the solution is effectively buying sufficient energy in advance to make sure that essentially a supply shortfall does not occur. And a good example of even a market where you had a $9,000 offer cap in Texas, you still had the potential for this reliability externality. It just, you needed this extreme weather conditions that existed in February 2021, where the amount of supply was actually less than the demand at this extremely high offer cap. So what we need, and the argument that is something that essentially we have essentially advanced purchase reservations for the energy needed to serve demand. The joke that I like to say is buying your energy on the short-term market under stress system conditions is like trying to fly standby on Thanksgiving. Good chance that you will not get on the airplane. For the same token, a good chance that you will find situations where there is inadequate supply to meet demand. The details of this mechanism is described in the two papers that I've discussed here, but the basic idea is purchasing the actual hourly system demands throughout the year in advance in fixed price, standardized financial contracts. And this creates the virtuous incentive that these buyers or sellers of these contracts, therefore have a strong incentive to be there to ensure that system demand is met during all hours of the year. And then to the extent that there is concern that you'll be able to meet that, you can tie the amount of this contract a supplier can sell to the generation unit that it owns, but this is essentially not necessary. But the idea is purchase far enough in advance to provide sufficient advance notice for suppliers to be able to meet that. So this leads up to no capacity requirement, but effectively focuses on the primary reliability problem that people face. So the final point I wanted to discuss briefly is this renewables procurement. And the basic idea here is just the fact that one of the big problems in these markets is renewables procurement mechanisms where essentially it is a paid as delivered contract, meaning the supplier gets paid as delivered when that contract delivers. This creates a tremendous output risk for the buyer of the contract that is not sustainable in a world. So the basic point is to try to eliminate these contracts, transition to the type of hedging arrangements that thermal resources actually provide in order to get the sorts of energy. And to the extent that you would like to support renewable energy, what you can do is set up a renewable energy certificates market. And that is an approach that can provide a least cost way to meeting a given renewable energy goal. So just to finish up, a low-cost renewable regime provides, I think, an opportunity to fund substantial amounts of these resources just through effectively market mechanisms, limit the amount of above-market financial support needed. But the necessary conditions for this are an efficient short-term market design, an energy-based long-term resource adequacy mechanism, and if you are setting targets for intermittent renewables, essentially intermittent renewable energy certificates markets, but only if you're setting a renewable energy target. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Bullock. That very interesting presentation on how the markets will help to integrate more intermittent renewable energy sources while not penalizing the consumers, because the market players will exploit it. So with that, let me now request Professor Komiyama, the discussant for this paper, to come in place. Thank you.
Yeah, I will share the slides, so just a moment, please. So thank you very much. And my name is Ryoichi Komiyama from the University of Tokyo. And let me make a comment on a paper by Professor Wallach, Financing the Energy Transition in Low-Cost Intermittent Renewable Environment. So the research agenda on the paper by Professor Wallach, mainly focusing on the efficient pricing in short-term energy market design and a long-term resource adequacy mechanism for renewable energy resource integration. And the paper extensively discussing about the, in case of a short-term energy market design, locational marginal pricing, and the Professor Wallach mentioned, and the multi-settlement, maybe the including the forward contract. And also in the presentation, not so much mentioned, but also the paper extensively emphasized the significance of REC, Renewable Energy Certificate. So maybe those are the very topical issues, and the many maybe a power system operator right now attract a lot of attention. And the achievement of the paper, simply speaking, this is a very excellent comprehensive analysis for ensuring power system adequacy as well as a short-term market design. First of all, the paper emphasized the significance of a nodal pricing, fully agree. Maybe the nodal pricing, maybe a successfully, maybe including the careful consideration for power grid constraint, and also maybe a globally power system operator maybe are facing how to optimize both the energy and the ancillary service. Theoretically, this is a very, mathematically, this is a very difficult problem, and this is a very good point. And also the paper emphasizes valuing a unit dispatchability and the flexibility. This is also a very important agenda in terms of integrating intermittent renewable. And also the paper proposed a challenge for renewable energy integration in terms of, this is a very interesting concept, reliability externality, how to internalize reliability externality in power grid, maybe electricity market design, and the role of capacity procurement mechanism, and also the Professor Wallach mentioned in the presentation, the capacity, how to assess the capacity credit of intermittent renewable. This is a very important topics of kind of the balancing the integration of intermittent renewable and the ensuring long-term power system adequacy. And also the professor maybe proposed raising the forward contract, maybe also maybe explain about the experience in Chile and Peru, a successful experience, how incentivizing the management of a renewable energy shortfall, such as storage investment. This is also very interesting, maybe the statement. So maybe based on the paper, maybe my discussion point is about how maybe ensuring long-term resource adequacy through CPM, capacity procurement mechanism. So internationally, many types of capacity procurement mechanism is implemented. So what is favorable or necessary or not, or something like that. And also I like the concept proposed by Professor Wallach, reliability externality. So right now, globally, maybe how to maybe ensuring the resilience of a power system towards maybe a natural disaster, something like that is a very important topics. But in that context, maybe what level of a price cap is desirable by regulator, limiting clearing price is also a very controversial issue right now. And also the reliability index for a power system operator, LOLP, LOLE, or EUE, which index is technically desirable? These kind of a technical discussion become more and more important right now. So maybe already proposed by Professor Wallach, how maybe the ensure investment in a competitive electricity market. So this is a chart show the gap between the wholesale electricity market revenue and the total generation cost. So simply speaking, the gap between revenue and the cost. So in the United States, as already explained by a professor, the share of total generation cost covered by a wholesale market declining as a result of low natural prices, and also the moderate demand and the rising share of intermittent renewable, or led by particularly in the wind power in the United States, have added the downward pressure on the wholesale electricity price in the several US electricity markets. So as well as in the European Union, particularly this is a downward pressure by intermittent renewables. How ensure long-term system adequacy is a very important point. And also maybe the how maybe integrate extensive intermittent renewable in a competitive electricity market is also very important topic. So right now, for example, in Japan, Japanese electricity market is fully liberalized. So right now in Japan, new electricity market are designed, already operated, in which the value of electricity power is traded for securing and the supply and the balancing capacity on a medium to long-term basis as the lowest cost. So we have 4 markets right now in Japan: wholesale electricity market, trading a kilowatt hour value, and the capacity market, trading kilowatt value, and the balancing market, delta kilowatt hour value, kind of a lumping, and the non-fossil fuel energy value trading market, kind of similar like renewable energy, maybe trading the renewable energy certificate, but in case of Japan, including nuclear energy. So maybe in competitive electricity market right now in Japan, maybe the power system of power generator should utilizing this 4 market and getting a revenue. So maybe how maybe these kind of multiple maybe value should be traded in a competitive market is very important topics. And capacity remuneration mechanism, maybe the paper mentioned missing money issues, maybe tackling missing money issues and the lower predictability of return on investment. So maybe the CPRM is necessary, but some maybe the researcher indicate unnecessary if power system become more flexible, like storage or demand response. So how to prepare the answer? This is also very important issue. And the type, centralized CRM in PJM, UK, Japan, decentralized France, and the strategic reserve in Germany, and no CRM in Texas. So what type is favorable? This is also a very important question. So maybe there is a benefit and risk. Maybe of course, farm adequacy, but the economic burden on the retailer and the consumer. So how to maybe recognize this kind of a benefit and risk? Reliability externality proposed by Professor Wallach. This is also very important concept. What level of price cap is desirable by regulator limiting clearing price? Nothing to say. Maybe reducing the economic burden of retailer and consumer is a very important objective. But also maybe this kind of externality is a kind of opportunity of revenue for power resources. So contributing some kind of somewhat long-term system adequacy. So how to maybe balancing these kind of issues is also an important maybe viewpoint. And the capacity adequacy of intermittent renewable, this is also ELCC is utilized, as well as maybe United States, Japan also adopt ELCC. And this is the capacity credit of solar and the capacity credit of wind. And if maybe already in Japan, IR massively integrated, maybe a capacity credit or a very low level, particularly in the winter season. So maybe I agree is maybe a point by Professor Wallach. LMMP is also very important maybe concept. Maybe the meaning the nodal difference of LMP is equal to value of power transmission right. So maybe a transmission congestion, maybe also LMP is a very helpful supportive index. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Komiyama. I'm not sure whether Professor Bullock would like to respond to some of the immediate ones which he raised. If you can pick up one or two out of it.
No, thank you very much for the comments. There's probably more questions there that would take 3 hours to answer. So, so I will probably, how about if we open it up for questions from the audience? But thanks very much. Definitely lots of interesting things to consider.
Thank you, Professor Bullock. Let me ask Ashim Roy. Can you ask the question directly? Can you unmute your mic and go ahead? Or shall I repeat it for you? He had asked what kind of grid capacity is ideal, solar and other renewable energy for mass replication across regions. I'm not sure whether it's clear for you, Professor Bullock. He is asking about the grid capacity, ideal grid capacity for solar and wind.
Well, that
you may have to
what I would say is that is the strength of a LMP market design, is that what you will find is that if you price the transmission network and the constraints that exist, you will find out where it makes sense to upgrade the transmission network versus continue to pay a different price. So for example, if the price difference between two locations is $20, but that only happens, say 10 hours per year, and the cost of the upgrade is significantly higher than that, then the right answer is you don't need to upgrade, just pay that cost difference. And that is the strength of the LMP design, is that you get these locational price signals that not only are good for operating the system, figuring out where to locate generation units, but also telling you, giving you very valuable information as to where you should be upgrading your transmission network. Otherwise, if you're running a market where you're not pricing the transmission network, where to upgrade the transmission network becomes largely a political process, or not a process where you have very informative data to help you to figure out where to upgrade.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Professor Bullock. In fact, this is what you call optimizing the benefit of transmission, right? Once the benefit of transmission is optimized, and you would strengthen the transmission to that level, not beyond that.
Yes. Yeah. And just to emphasize that the optimal amount of congestion is not zero. If that's zero congestion, their network is very expensive. That's like, that would not be the right answer, and that's often a difficult point to get across. But it is a good example of this for the electricity insiders is the Alberta electricity market. What it did was essentially said that we will build the transmission network to ensure that congestion never occurs or rarely occurs. And they have made they have by far the highest transmission charge in the world per megawatt hour of energy. And it certainly is probably not the least cost way to do it. Preferable would be to implement locational pricing and only upgrade where it makes economic sense.
Exactly. You're very right. I mean, with my background in transmission pricing, it says that you have to price the transmission network based on the optimal transmission design, which will provide the maximum benefit of transmission. Yeah, there is another question from Ashim. Again, what factors determine the power purchase agreement in renewable energy? Again,
well, that
Roy, would you?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's the whole point of, at least the big point that I would say of the paper, is what I would like to do and it with the proper design is you create a market that provides revenue streams to the renewable resources through the market mechanisms, such that as many as possible renewable resources can be built without the need for additional above market support. So in other words, I can look out there as a potential investor and say, all right, it makes sense for me to build a, say, solar resource to meet this increase in energy need, given the prices that I see in the spot market, the forward contracts that I'm able to sign. And but in some instances, in some regions, that may not be possible if there is, say, a renewable energy goal that is so great that the economics of the renewable resources are such that it can't be financed from market revenues. That's the reason for the so-called renewable energy certificates market that I was talking about, where if you're setting, say, as we're doing in California, a 60% renewable energy share, that's not something that we're going to get to through a pure sort of no market mechanism, no support mechanism. So what we do is we create this market for the renewable attribute and we trade that. So you as a renewable resource owner, you sell this REC, renewable energy certificate, for each megawatt of energy you produce. That provides the additional revenue stream to get your project off the ground and financed in order to meet that renewable energy goal.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions from audience? If you have anything, please type that on into a Q&A box. I would be able to read it off, or you can yourself read it. One question from my side, Professor Bullock, and now in our part of the world, in the Asia and the Pacific, you have many countries without these competitive markets, and it's basically standard dispatch regimes, and the intermittent resources come in and they are more or less power purchase obligations such that they have to buy all what comes into the system. And so you basically part load or compensate that by part loading other plants which are being dispatched. So in such markets, do you have any idea how we can look at your or adapt your model into such systems?
Yeah, precisely. That's the purpose of the so-called what I discussed as the cost-based market. Is what you can do is you can effectively say, look, we are going to dispatch the system based upon these costs, and to the extent that we'll ship the money back and forth to make sure that the contracts are honored. But the whole purpose is that we want to make sure that we're always using the most efficient resources in the short-term market. So let's take an example. Suppose that you are a very expensive thermal resource that got a long-term contract at a very attractive price. And it is a 24/7 contract. We don't want you to run 24/7 if there are cheaper resources out there, but we will guarantee that you get paid your revenue stream. So what you would do is that resource is just simply not produce, but buy out of the short-term market, this cost-based market, and to supply the energy that you're supposed to be supplying, and you would get paid your forward contract price that you had. But we don't want to essentially distort the short-term dispatch in order to make sure that you get paid. That's just sort of two wrongs, and they definitely aren't making a right. You're making it more expensive to operate the system, yet you're still paying the same amount of money. At least what we should do is operate the system as inexpensively as possible, but make sure your contract as the generator is honored in the sense that you get the revenue stream you're promised.
Thank you very much for that answer. I think we are more or less at the end of that presentation. let me thank Professor Bullock for the excellent presentation and fantastic answers you have provided to the questions came in. And with that, let me move on to the second presenter. Thank you very much, Professor Bullock, and the discussant, of course, Professor Komiyama. Let me now move to the paper, the second paper, which is on secure energy transition in power sector with high shares of variable renewables. And this presentation is will be delivered by Mr. Pirapat Vitya Sri Chariyan. He is the lead analyst, renewable integration and secure electricity unit of the International Energy Agency in Paris. And the paper will be discussed by Ms. Rika Safrina. She is actually Energy Modeling and Policy Planning Officer, in ASEAN Center for Energy in Indonesia. With that very short introduction of the two contributors, let me now invite Pirapat to make the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanta. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Yes, thank you.
So this one display.
Can you please change settings? There are extended screen viewing. Yes.
Sorry.
Can you please change display settings? Yeah.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Great, thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. So hold on. Let me. Okay, so thank you for the introductions. As mentioned, I'm with the Renewable Integration and Secure Electricity Unit. So our work is on providing recommendations in terms of policy as well as the technical recommendations in terms of integrating renewables into the system to ensure the electricity security. So the outline of my presentation today is that firstly, we're going to look at the pathway and the gap in achieving net zero emissions. This is based on the recent COP26, as many of you have been following. And then after that, I'm going to talk about the transitions of the power sector towards a low carbon future, how it changes from the traditional systems that we have seen over the past decades to accommodate the increasing share of renewables. This is particularly focusing on the wind and solar generation, which we call the variable renewables, and how do we integrate this variable renewables into the power system. I'm going to identify the challenges and also the opportunities and options in order to help to integrate wind and solar into the system. And then I'm going to talk about the flexibility, the challenge, and also the requirements in terms of how the power system requiring increasing the flexibility need in order to maintain electricity security. We'll look at the policy and also the technology options in order to boost the system flexibility. Before I start, I just want to briefly provide the information and also background of the International Energy Agency, which is the intergovernmental organization. So we have 30 member countries from the OECD. In addition to that, because of our open door policy to emerging countries in 2015, the family of the IEA also includes 8 association countries. In Southeast Asia, these include Indonesia, Thailand, and also Singapore. In terms of energy demand, the IEA now accounts for more than 75% of global energy demand. The 2 countries that are seeking accession to full memberships, including Chile and Lithuania. Now, I'm going to talk about the pathway and the gap in achieving net zero emissions. Ahead of the COP26, as many of you have been following, that was held last month, the World Energy Outlook 2021, which was released prior to the COP26, showed that even if all the announced pledges that were implemented in order to achieve the carbon neutrality in many countries, we would still be missing the goals of the Paris Agreement in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, as we would be headed for 2.1 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And this is going to cause the impact in terms of increasing the climate risk. So despite the progress seen, the announced pledges scenarios as shown on the graph here in the yellow label, there's still substantial gap in terms of reaching the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. So this gap is particularly large in the short term to 2030, as near-term actions lags behind the pace seen in net zero emissions by 2050 scenarios. In 2030, as shown on this graph, the total CO2 emissions are around 36 gigaton in the announced pledges scenarios. The reductions of around 3 gigatons compared to the steps, which is the state policy scenarios, that is according to announcement by the countries in terms of their policies, which means that the announced pledges close only 20% of the gap between the stated policies and the net zero emission scenarios. The countries with pledges and those without each will be responsible for about half the remaining gap between the pledges scenarios and the one that's going to achieve the net zero emissions. So this suggests that all of the countries will need to step up their efforts in order to close the gaps in order to achieve the net zero by 2050. In order to achieve the clean energy transitions, so investments will be very important and it needs to be scaled up substantially. In the net zero emissions, the total energy sector capital spending will increase from around, as you see here, 2.5% of the gross of the GDP per year in recent year to around 4.5% of GDP in 2030. And this before easing to around 2.5% in 2050. So by 2030, the vast majority of the investment will go toward the electricity generations, with the total investment increasing from around 0.5 trillion US dollars to 1.7 trillion in 2030. Other investment in other sectors, including in buildings, transport, industry, energy infrastructure, and also fuel productions. But as mentioned, the majority will go towards power generation. So in terms of transitioning of the power sector towards low carbon future, as we know, for more than several decades, the power sector has worked under very stable principles, and the technologies are conventional based on the centralized dispatch systems. Deployment of assets was divided by the central planning process, by the vertically integrated utility, relying on analog algorithms. There's not so much of digitalization, and emerging technologies still not existed back then. But the system, the flow of energy is only in one direction. That means going from power plants through transmission grids, through to distribution grids, and through to the consumers. And the number of devices, it's still relatively small, as you see on the graph here. But the landscape now is changing very fast. The power system will increasingly be more decentralized. There's a large share of electricity that coming from variable renewables, particularly wind and solar, which has a different characteristic comparing to conventional generation technologies such as gas and coal-fired generations. And there's also changing climate patterns that affect the demand and supply, as we've seen recently, the events that occur in Texas earlier this year that caused the interruptions in supply and also change the demand patterns that can cause a challenge in terms of system operations. The electricity security is the key in order to, when we talk about integrating renewables into the system. So what is electricity security? For the work that we have been doing for the past couple of years that we focus on electricity security, we define it as the system capability to ensure uninterrupted availability of electricity in order to withstand and recover from disturbances and also contingency that occur in the power sector, it has three properties, which are operational security, adequacy, and resilience. Adequacy is the ability of the system to supply the demand within an area at all times under normal operating conditions. So the reliability metrics, which has been discussed in the previous papers, that include the metrics such as energy not expected, energy not served, loss of load expectation, loss of load probability, and so on. On the operational security is the ability of the system to retain normal state or return to normal state as soon as possible after the events that occurs. Resilience is the ability of the system and also the component part, which is to absorb and accommodate and also recover from both the short-term and also from the long-term changes in the system. Wind and solar PV generation has been one of the cost-effective, becoming the cost-effective sources to close the gap to achieve net zero by 2050. Renewables, particularly wind and solar, will become the backbone of the clean power system. As you see here, in 2020, the share of wind and solar PV in total electricity generations in many regions are still less than 10%. Based on the IEA forecast, by 2025, most regions will have the share of wind and solar exceeding 10%, some more than 20% in places like Europe and also in the US. But then as we look toward 2050, we see massive accelerations of the share of wind and solar that can exceed close to 60%, such as in regions like in India and also in Europe. Increasing share of wind and solar PV in electricity generation requires greater flexibility in a power system in order to ensure electricity security, because of the unique characteristic that coming from wind and solar being variable and also being partly uncertain. And also it is creating a challenge due to the non-dispatchable characteristic to the system operator. So this unique characteristic of variable renewables and the way that they interact with the broader power system give rise to the system integration challenges. So the IEA, we have categorized the integration of variable renewables into a framework made of 6 different phases, which can be used to prioritize different measures in order to support system flexibility and also to address the challenges that coming from a higher share of variable renewables. So the main characteristic of different phases are that in phase 1, the capacity of variable renewables is not so relevant because that is not noticeable by system operator. Then moving to phase 2, this when the capacity of wind and solar become noticeable to system operator, they can see the changes that caused by the wind and solar, which is affecting the operating patterns of conventional generation. You see more ramping requirements and also start and shut down of the conventional generator. Then moving to phase 3, flexibility becomes relevant because of the larger swings in the supply and the demand curve that caused by wind and solar generations. Then in phase 4, this is where stability becomes so relevant because the system will experience periods where wind and solar generation will make up almost of all generation, which is close to 100%, and it could be more than 100%. And this is where the stability of system become a relevant issue and become a key concern to system operator. In phase 5, there will be a structural change caused by the surplus that coming from wind and solar. That's growing amount of surplus that in the period of days to weeks and longer periods, which will require a longer term storage option. This is similar to phase 6 as well, that there's more wind and solar coming to the system. There'll be surplus that come in the scale of seasonal and interannual surpluses. These are the flexible options to address in each phase of the integrating variable renewables that, from phase 1 to phase 2, for example, we need to look at the forecasting system to ensure the proper economic dispatch. And then from phase 2 to phase 3, you have to retrofit power plants, especially conventional, because they have the capability in terms of addressing the challenge that coming from wind and solar generations. And then advanced technologies to increase stability, particularly the storage, batteries, energy storage system, for example, and also demand side response. And then for the longer term surplus, then the medium term storage, as well as the long-term energy storage, power to gas, renewable fuel trades will become important in order to accommodate the large share of renewables in the system. International examples also help to illustrate different phases. As shown on this graph, most of the countries in the Southeast Asia are still in phase 1, where the share of wind and solar are still less than 10%. Note that the figure is based on the 2019 data. While the larger system have currently lower share of variable renewables. So the larger system, they have more resources in order to accommodate the wind and solar. So they'll be in the lower phase. And this one in phase 2, the countries such as India, France, Japan, China, and Australia, with the share of variable renewables around 10%. And then moving on to phase 3, many countries in Europe and part of the regions in China and also in Japan that's in phase 3, where the share of variable renewables are exceeding 20%. And then in phase 4, there are currently three regions, which are Ireland, South Australia, and Denmark, where the share of variable renewables can be as high as almost 60%. As the countries and regions are attaining high shares of generation that come from wind and solar, they also experience much higher instantaneous penetrations. Instantaneous, that means in a certain period, let's say in a dispatch period of maybe in 30 minutes or in an hourly interval. So this one showing the annual share, which has been reflected in previous graph. But then when we look at the instantaneous share, we can see that in some of the countries, instantaneous shares can be as more than 100%, let's say, for example, in Denmark, in South Australia. And they generate more than the demand within that regions, but then because of the interconnections, they were able to export those into other regions. So over time, increasing number of countries will be in the situations of supplying almost 100% of demand with renewables, particularly wind and solar, as mentioned. So now they will face the question whether they can, how they're going to handle this in terms of both from the operational point of view and also from the economic aspect as well. So this is where the flexibility will come in, because meeting flexibility needs is important in order to ensure electricity security. So flexibility has always been a very important part of power system as part of a requirement for system operations, because this is due to the need to manage the variability and uncertainty of demand and supply. So the system has always been facing the demand variability and also the supply variability. But then because of the characteristic that coming from wind and solar, this is caused more challenge for the system operator. The time scales also become an issue as well, because flexibility are relevant for all the time scales that, from sub-seconds through to years. This includes, on the short time scales, they include the dealing with the contingency, such as plant and transmission outages, sudden demand changes. And why is flexibility is important? Because it will enable the system to maintain continuous services in the face of rapid and also the large swing in supply and demand. But different countries will have different flexibility requirements. Some may have shorter term flexibility needs in order to address the issue of stability, frequency control, and also the voltage fluctuations. But then in other countries, it may need to focus on flexibility that are on a longer term aspect between days, weeks, or even seasons, which is part of the system planning. So understanding the system, the current flexibility need and also the future flexibility need will also important as part of not only system operation, but also power system planning in a longer term time scale. There are a variety of options for policy, markets, and regulatory instruments that can boost system flexibility. This option can be grouped into several categories of interventions for policymakers to consider and are shown here on this slide. Note that the institutional framework is key to identify possible instruments to support flexibility. So the key stakeholders from the institutional aspects are Energy Ministry, for example, regulatory agency, system operator, electric utility. In terms of the policy and market and regulatory frameworks, the categories of interventions are that coming from Energy Ministry, for example, including the strategies, legal frameworks, policy, and programs. And from the regulatory agency point of view, it's the regulatory frameworks and decisions, a power sector planning exercise, retail electricity pricing, for example. And from the system operator point of view, this is about the market rules such as grid codes, the procedures in terms of operating the system, operational practices, connection codes. And in terms of the hardware infrastructure, what are the flexibility asset types that could help to increase flexibility of the system? There are the four main types, which include power plants, electricity networks, energy storage, and distributed energy resources that including demand responses, and also other resources on the demand side. As you can see that the system resources has been, before that it relied on four main resources which are independently, but now we need to consider them in a way that integrated manners because they are all linked to each other. So as mentioned, conventional power plant is one of the main source, at least in the near term, in order to help to increase flexibility to accommodate the high share of renewables. So we can see that the thermal generations, it is already a business as usual today because, for example, the coal plant in Germany has been operating flexibly over the past many years. As you can see the generation patterns here, you can see the ramping up and down of coal-fired generation in order to accommodate the high share of particularly the solar PV in Germany. And then on the right-hand side graph, you see the operation of nuclear power plants in France. You can see that although it's still a baseload technology, but it has the technical capability in order to be dispatched up and down in order to meet the variation that coming from the net demand that caused by wind and solar generations. So power plants are still an important source of flexibility in order to help us to transition in towards the clean energy in the future, because in the near term, many countries are still relying on thermal generations, such as natural gas and coal in some countries, for example, in India, in China, and also in Indonesia, which are still depends on coal plants in the near term. But of course, when we're moving towards green energy, towards clean energy, there's an option of retrofitting these thermal power plants in order to use a low carbon fuels such as biomass, and also in the future can use hydrogens and also other synthetic fuel. So in order to integrate the needed amount of renewable, flexibility needs are important, and the requirement of the flexibility will increase in order to accommodate the change that we're going to be facing when we transition towards clean energy. As you can see from this graph, that the composition of technologies that will provide flexibility will change as we move toward net zero. In the year 2020, in both advanced economies and also in emerging economies, you can see that the flexibility at present are mostly coming from the conventional generation. This includes coal and also natural gas. But as we move towards net zero and also advanced pledges scenarios, we can see the contributions of coal and gas are becoming less and we see more of the emerging technologies such as batteries that will provide flexibility. And as we move toward net zero emissions, hydrogen and ammonia will be also important resources as well to provide flexibility. And you see less contribution that coming from coal and natural gas. Cross-border transmission network is also another key flexibility resources, which can increase the flexibility of the system. This graph shows the flow. It might be difficult to read, but basically it shows the flow of energy between different regions within Europe. You can see that the power flows increased quite significantly from 2000 to 2018. And this is both in terms of the absolute value in the terawatt hour and as a percentage of the regional demand. So cross-border arrangement will be a key in order to help to integrate more renewables coming into the system. But of course, the arrangement of the cross-border trade, it can be complex and can be quite difficult to achieve because it involves political, commercial, and technical issues. But there are obviously benefits in order to help to integrate more renewables into the system. This one is showing the how the power system today rely on traditional technology in providing flexibility, similar to the previous graph that I showed in earlier slide, but this one showing the contributions of each of the resources in providing energy, peak capacity, flexibility in terms of the ramping requirements, and stability in order to address the short-term aspect. So this figure is coming from the recent study that we did for ASEAN regions. You can see that in 2018, the contributions are mostly coming from thermal generations in all of the system services that I mentioned. But then as we move toward the longer term in 2035 on the
Dr.
sustainability.
Can we wrap up soon?
Yes, sure. The contribution that coming from hydro will be more, as well as from variable renewables. And in the broader context, so these are the key in achieving system resilience, which consists of efficient operation of power system, unlocking flexibility from all resources, ensuring security of electricity supply, and also sufficient investment in clean generation capacity. And another one that needs to be taken into account is the pricing of the externalities, such as carbon pricings. So I'll end my presentations here. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pirapat, for that excellent presentation, touching on the technical aspects and the difficulties when it comes to accommodating in particular intermittent renewable energies and how different phases will be impacted by these intermittent sources and the need for flexibility in the power systems. So with that, let me now move to the discussant, Ms. Rika Safrina from Indonesia ASEAN Energy Center, ASEAN Center for Energy. Safrina, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen first. Yeah, may I check if the screen is displayed?
Yeah.
Okay.
We can see it now.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good morning from Indonesia. My name is Rika Safrina from the ASEAN Center for Energy. Thank you for the opportunity to join this conference. Also, thank you very much to Dr. Pirapat Sricharoen for your insightful presentation. It was a pleasure to hear your explanation regarding securing energy transition in the power sector with high share of variable renewables. It is very interesting and it is an honor for me to discuss it. Let me start my discussion with the overview. Okay. So, yeah, Dr. Pitaya Sricharoen provided us solid elements and guidance on how to integrate the high share of variable renewable energy, or VRE, including solar and wind, into the electricity system in order to accelerate clean energy transition. VRE is now driving the ongoing decarbonization of the power sector, but the intermittent nature, the unstable supply, high penetration of VRE can lead to power instability. And because VRE is non-dispatchable energy, and this study, the challenge of the intermittent was very nicely put by this research, addressed by this research. The presentation also very well laid out the 6 phases of VRE integration. Each has its key transition challenges and flexibility options to move up from one level to the high levels. From the presentation, we could understand clearly that power system flexibility has become a priority to ensure electricity security and resilience. The relevant contribution of this study, I think, it provides the potential solutions to close the gap in reaching net zero emissions. As you know, currently more and more countries have pledged to meet net zero emissions targets, including ASEAN member states or Southeast Asian nations, such as Brunei Darussalam in 2050, Indonesia in 2060, and Thailand in 2065. Regionally, ASEAN set the RE target to have 35% of share in its installed capacity by 2025. After much consideration of the region's capabilities. Last year, according to data in 2020, the RE share already reached 33.5%, only 1.5% gaps from the target. However, this target does not differentiate precisely to VRE, and also the target was set before the COP26. I think the COP26 might influence the regional target in the future energy blueprint to make more ambitious target. But there are challenges in integrating more VRE, and the research by Dr. Vita Sricharan provides one of the solutions to reaching this goal. Another contribution, I think, is answering the challenges governments face in VRE integration in different phases. Each country has different trajectories and capabilities, so one answer cannot suit them all. And this study provides potential solutions for different kinds of conditions of the countries. When we look at the methodology used in analyzing the data, the research used a modeling approach with several scenarios to model pathways and the gap in achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong. And the first one is pre-Paris baseline scenario, which is the projection of global emissions before Paris Agreement took place in 2015. And the next one is stated policy scenario or STEPS, which reflects the current specific policies that are in place and have been announced by the governments around the world. Next is announced place scenario or APS, which assumes that all climate ambitions or climate commitment from the governments will be met in full and on time. As you can see on the slides of the before, the APS pushed down emission compared to STEP scenario. And the next one is sustainable development scenario that goes further and faster to be aligned with the Paris Agreement's objective of holding the global average temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius. Last but not least, net zero emissions, which sets out a narrow but claimed to be achievable pathway for a global energy sector to reach net zero emission by 2050. And it also aligned with Paris Agreement's objective of limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Aside from modeling approach, the presentation was also equipped with case studies or examples from regions with a large share of VRE and cross-border interconnections. I think we can see the strength of this study is in the model by taking into account the COP26 outcomes that just ended about 2 weeks ago. We can see the ambition gap exists between the APS and NZE scenarios that requires countries to go beyond the existing pledges to be on track on the to reach net zero emissions by 2050. One clarification that I could draw is in one of the slides, there is a chart displaying several countries with their categorization of VRE penetration. Either they are in phase 1, 2, 3, or 4. What I would like to know from Dr. Vita Sricharan perhaps is how these countries are categorized into each phase. What is the quantitative measure? For example, perhaps a country in phase 1 is the country with RE share between 1 and 5% in electricity generation, or how is it? I think that information could be added or explained to make the audience clear. Regarding data analysis, I really like the presentation with simple text and a lot of data visualization like we've just seen. For example, this investment figure, financial support is an imperative important point to achieve the climate goals. So investment data is very useful. We can see it's more than $3 trillion US gap from current investment to 2030. But I think the required investment could be separated between advanced and developing economies. So we will know exactly how much the developing countries need. And then there is a partial text in the caption saying 85% spending for clean energy. I think could be further elaborated since it does not explain the graph. Next is regarding the chart where countries are assigned with their integration phases. It's missing the data on which year this assessment took place, but then I heard from the presentation just now that it was using 2019 data. And another input perhaps in the electricity, this diagram, electricity system flexibility by source and scenario. Now we can see that batteries and DSR, demand side response, are having the largest shares from the projected flexibility sources by 2050. I think it would be very helpful if these technologies could be further discussed, such as how to accelerate the implementation, the cost, the risk, and so on. The presentation then answers the topic question with several questions of others. The first one, PRE is cost-effective technology measures that can help to close the ambition gap between the FES and NZE scenarios. And then the 6 phases of integration plan is very well input to increase the PRE share. I think that is the one of the most contribution of this study. And the presentation out that enhancing power flexibility is driven by several policy interventions at different levels of decision making, such as in energy ministry, regulatory agency, and utilities. I have only a few comments regarding the result. Perhaps the study could consider the technical capability of the country in integrating PRE into their power system. It could be by looking at their conditional NDC commitment or their PRE potential. Secondly, try to perhaps to consider mitigation plan on the 6 phases of integration. For example, Texas may be in the phase 3 of PRE integration. We know that it has a transition challenge in power supply robustness, and the potential solution to offer this is by having advanced technologies such as batteries, digitalization, smart grids, and DSR. But we do not know what is the best mitigation action that Texas can do when experiencing a power outage like last year due to a long and severe winter. Perhaps this kind of information could be provided so decision makers could include this risk in their plan and strategies, and they are well prepared. Some other recommendations for better policy implication or for future research, perhaps to consider to provide this list, such as information in technicalities from countries with high PRE shares, concrete guidance for decision makers to boost system flexibility, examples from countries that have successfully implemented each of the policy interventions in implementing flexibility sources, and practical operational guidelines for flexible thermal power plants. Overall, the research is very comprehensive and answers the challenges in PRE integration. I think that's all from me. Thank you very much again to Dr. Fitaisri Charon for the excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rika, for that excellent discussion of the paper. And let me quickly ask whether there is immediate reaction from Dr. Pirapat for the points raised during the discussion, and then we can quickly move to the question and answer session.
All right. Thanks very much, Rika, for the comments. I can't address all of the questions given the timing, and also some of the work also done by other team within the IEA as well. But I'll reply in terms of the how do we access in terms of which phase each country is in that has been shown in the graph. Basically, one of the main components, as you mentioned, is the share of variable renewables, wind and solar. But then it's a context specific, it depends on the system. Also, so we need to look at in terms of what are the resources and what are the options that are available within that countries or regions in order to help in terms of providing the services in order to accommodate wind and solar that are coming into the system. For example, the key flexibility options that I mentioned are power plants. This include, for example, conventional generations, as well as the renewable, particularly hydro, which has the capability in providing flexibility service in both of the short to medium term. Another one is the transmission grid, because a well interconnected system within the regions can help to share resource and also to help to address the issue that coming from the variability and uncertainty of wind and solar. And as we move up, as there are more share of renewables into the system, as you have mentioned, the storage will become a key, particularly the battery storage, which we have tried to identify. This is the conceptual framework though, because it needs to apply to each of the countries, because the storage can be a key one in order to moving from phase 3 to phase 4. And then for phase 4, where you have a lot of wind and solar, the stability become important. This is where the technical challenge and the detailed study that need to be done in order to see that how much renewables that can be accommodated. For example, the study has been done by AirGrid, so they have come up with the numbers in order to limit the share of the variable renewables in particular instance, for example, at the 70% at the moment, and they have the plan to increase up to 80 to 90% in the future. Those are just a brief response.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pirapat. There is a question from the audience, Daniel Augustine, of course, congratulating you for the excellent presentation and asking who is responsible for various different phases and what is the kind of timetable you are looking at overall?
Yeah, this is a great question. I would say the main key are, as mentioned, policymakers, regulators, and also system operator in order to help to address all these challenges and enable the system to accommodate the high share of variable renewables. From the policymaker point of view, they need to come up with the policy options to encourage investment in the variable renewables, wind and solar, create incentives for the investors in order to invest. And then for the system operator point of view, they need to be able to address the challenge that coming from the technical side to operate the system in a reliable manner to help to accommodate, these unique characteristics of wind and solar. So, policymakers, regulators, system operators, of course, are important. In terms of what the other questions was it? The time frame, is it? Or
that's right. The time frame.
So the time frame is that we have to prepare. At present, we need to see what the existing assets in the system that we have, because the existing assets are valuable in order to address the current challenges. And then we need to plan for the future on a longer term aspect from the power system planning perspective, because we need to foresee that wind and solar will become the main building block of the power system. So system planning need to accommodate, need to take into account what are the options in the longer term to help with more wind and solar that are coming from the system, like flexible power plants and so on.
Also, there is another question from the same person, that Augustine, asking who is responsible for the flexibility in the power system at the end, in the sense, I presume the regulators and the system operators have the responsibility to bring in the flexibility. I mean, what's your viewpoint on that?
Yes. In addition to regulator, policymakers, and also system operator, it would be also the market player as well, like the one that operate the power plant, that own the power plants, that they need to look at to make the for example, the power plant owners need to make their power plant a bit more flexible. But this again depends on the policy that coming from the policy makers in order to provide incentives, because there need to be incentive to provide to power plant in order to operate more flexibly, not just supply energy and not just only the capacity, but also the services that they can provide into the system, such as they have a fast ramping capability and also providing, for example, the inertia, which are quite important. So yeah, power plant owner as well.
Thank you. Then there is another question from Yixing Yao. What is your opinion on the most urgent and priority works for most of the DMCs in Asia and the Pacific governments to do next regarding the topic? What should we do next as far as Asia and the Pacific is concerned when it comes to, I presume, improving flexibility in the power systems?
Yeah, as mentioned, this one is including the action that we could do at present and also prepare for the future. So at present, we need to look at what are the assets that we already have. Has it been fully utilized? Has it been, because many of the assets in the power system, particularly power plant, they have the technical flexibility. So these are the ones that could address in the short term, like providing incentives, retrofit power plants, which may not be as expensive as investing in a new flexibility options. This is to help to address a shorter term challenge. And then moving forward, the issues of new technologies like battery storage will become important. Demand side response need to be taken into account. And of course, the longer term, the options of like power to X, hydrogen, synthetic fuels, which are still expensive at the moment, particularly in the developing countries. But this could be an options that policymakers may consider as one of the options. But of course, this depends on other factors as well that they need to look into a bit more detail.
There's another question. Thank you. What is the status of grid technology interoperability between conventional and renewable? I don't know whether the question is clear. What is the status of grid technology? Do we have the adequate technologies at the moment to ensure this flexibility in the power systems? I mean, if I put it in a different form.
Yeah. I think this one also related to previous question as well, that because many developing countries, when they see the wind and solar come into the system, they start to be a bit concerned. But as mentioned, in phase 1 and phase 2, what you already have in your system, you can use that to accommodate the wind and solar that come into the system. So yeah, so the key technology as mentioned is what you already have, like conventional technology at the moment. Could be coal-fired power plant, gas-fired, natural gas-fired power plants. They have the technical flexibility, but they need to adjust like operational practices. There might be the constraint that coming from the power purchase agreement that prevent them to operate more flexibly. So I think in a shorter term, and also in many developing countries, the issue of contracts, the constraint that coming from power purchase agreement and also the fuel supply contract need to be looked at.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Pirapat. And are there any other questions coming from the audience? Of course, there was one question from me, that is whether ADB can help to bring down the cost of renewables. Yes, of course, this is exactly what we are trying to do as a development financier, to bring in as much concessionary financing as possible, and then to tap into other grant funding and climate finance, whatever available through our banking system. So we'll do our best. And also just one last question from my side, not a question, actually comment, and it seems that the cross-border interconnection and integration will play an enormous role when it comes to this flexibility in power transmission systems. I suppose that's quite evident in Europe, with Denmark and everybody else having high share of renewables connected to a bigger network. And so I think we should really concentrate on that too, particularly in our part of the world where the technologies, adoption of technology may not be as fast as possible cross-border interconnections. With that, let me thank all the presenters, the discussants, and the participants who brought in very important questions and the responses provided by both the discussants and the presenters. And it has been a very interesting session, and thank you very much, and have a great day. Thank you to all of you.
Speakers, many thanks for this wonderful first day of the annual conference. I would like to just to say that we're looking forward to see you tomorrow. This is a 3-day event, and this is one day of the 3 days event. So we're looking forward to see you tomorrow again. The same link will work on all 3 days. And tomorrow we are starting at 9:50 of Tokyo time with 3 sessions: carbon pricing, regional cooperation, and buildings. Registration is open at any time of this event till the end of this event. More registrations are welcome. So I will just play our promotional video, and after that we'll conclude this day.
Thank you, Dina.